CD4.
Lapin held the warrant from the city police in his hands, which he began to fussily unroll. What posturing self-importance! Did their rendezvous render her position favourable or doomed? He spoke in a reedy voice. A smudge of victory crept into his eyes. Or was she imagining things? For the life of her she could not decide. "You needn't have come so well attended," she interrupted, not bothering to hide her contempt. But Lapin would not be dissuaded from his speech. "On the 9th of April, Monsieur Claude Tiquet filed a complaint, prompting me, Lieutenant General of Police, to authorize an investigation. The testimonies of your neighbours and of Monsieur's cousin and servants have been recorded, and you are hereby charged with the attempted murder of your husband." "I am not leaving my home," Nicola began after some pause. A quiet rage had entered her voice. She turned to Marthe. "Has the world gone stark raving mad?" She glared at Lapin. "You are working for my husband. You wish me to leave so that he might steal my house from under my very feet. But I shall not go with you. I am innocent." "Madame Tiquet," Lapin spoke with patience, "we must proceed with the law. You are to come with us to the Petit Châtelet. Do not make me use force." "It's best you go with them," whispered Marthe, searching her eyes. She reached for Nicola's hands. "Pour her a drink of water," she instructed the maid. "But I'm innocent," protested Nicola. "You know that." She rushed over to the fire, grasping the picture of Clotilde and kissing it fervently. She turned to Lapin. "I'll not be forced out of my home by that evil man. It's too much. I've suffered too much." Nicola glanced at Marthe for confirmation, but her friend had turned ashen white. Marthe's fingers trembled. She looked as if she wanted to be anywhere in the city but there, witnessing her companion's last moments as a free woman. Nicola drew in a deep breath. A feeling of resignation began to unfold in her mind, as if, all along, in some other part of her thoughts, she had been waiting for this day. "Have your way, then," she addressed Lapin. "I shall accompany you. But I know the truth. That man wishes to get his hands on my money, a design he has held since the day we first met. Justice will be served. I shall die defending what's mine." She had to bid Jean-Paul farewell. "I must request a favour." Lapin rolled up the scroll, handing it to one of the guards. "Yes?" "First, might I have a moment with my son?" she said, her voice exquisitely controlled. "Be quick about it," said Lapin. Lapin accompanied her to the top floor. She walked, her heart thumping with fear, barely able to breathe along the wide panelled hallway. Jean-Paul's nursery was just past the doors to her own large chambers. She knocked on the door, waiting a moment and then turning the handle. Jean-Paul was sitting on the rug, playing with a toy chariot. "My darling boy," she said, rushing to wrap him in her arms. "Maman has to go away for a few days, but I will be back soon. You are to be a good boy. You must eat all your meals and do everything nurse asks of you." She caught his gaze. "Do you understand, my love?" "Yes, maman," said Jean-Paul. He glanced at the police chief. His lip trembled, but he did not attempt a spoilt outburst. Her eyes were clear as she walked from the nursery along the corridor, her agony at leaving her son buried deep. She had a plan. The commissioner walked in silence as she drew Jacques' key from her bodice and unlocked the double doors to her chamber. She turned to him, affecting intimacy, and asked him to hold out his hand. Taking several silver écus from her purse, she folded her fingers around his gloved palm. She told him there was plenty more. You need only make a request. She proposed that Lapin post 2 police guards at the gates to her home, that he seal off the house, forbidding Monsieur Tiquet from entering the grounds of the property. She had the right to ban his entry. The title deeds had been signed in her name. He agreed. A small victory. She farewelled Marthe with a kiss. Such a thrill her neighbours would receive, watching her being escorted into the marked carriage. Madame Sévigné would steal a long glance through her curtains, taking care to preserve every detail of the spectacle, to be retold with lashings of relish and embellishment at some later date. Nicolas knew the ins and outs of Paris gossip only too well. Their tongues would speak no mercy. Marie-Catherine, 18th of April. Pierre de Clément selected a blue hat with a silver trim, inspecting it in the hall mirror. Do you approve? He affected a little pose, tilting his head and holding his fingers under his chin, tapping his lips. Promise to behave yourself. Marie-Catherine kissed her son-in-law good day as she stepped into the entranceway of Deirdre's home. The Cléments were an old Normandy family, and their eldest son carried himself with the negligent confidence of one born to tremendous privilege. He was thin and tall, with a bump on his nose and large hooded brown eyes, a cleft chin and the most enviably expressive hands. Rings gleamed on several fingers, drawing Marie-Catherine's eye as they tipped and touched the buttons of his lilac coat. Despite her determination not to control her daughters' lives, Marie-Catherine had decided it was necessary to involve herself in the couple's marriage negotiations. Pierre's father, well aware of his son's frivolous tendencies, had provided a generous yearly allowance, though strictly limited, to prevent them spiralling into out-of-control debt. The potential was certainly there. "Let me help," said the maid, hanging up Marie-Catherine's cape. "Madame's in her apartments." The door to Deirdre's plush chamber was open, and Marie-Catherine caught her in a moment of unguardedness. Her feet stretched out on the chaise longue, listlessly turning the pages of Le Mercure Galant. She wore a red silk dressing gown and had not had her hair dressed. It fell limply to her shoulders. "Mamma!" exclaimed Deirdre, slowly rising to her feet. Clutching her large belly, she gingerly walked towards her. "I appreciate you visiting." She kissed Marie-Catherine's cheeks and then grasped her around the shoulders, falling for the briefest moment into her arms. She led Marie-Catherine to the chaise set before the fire. "Everyone's preparing to leave for the summer. I feel abandoned already. Teresa's busy. The children exhaust me. I can barely find the strength to cuddle them. It's worse than ever this time." "Whatever is that smell?" asked Marie-Catherine, sniffing the room. "Chinese tea? Isn't it delicious? It's the firewood. It's been treated so it gives off a fragrance when it burns." Deirdre made a show of enjoying the scent. She pointed to her mantilla, magenta velvet, lying across the chair at her dressing table. "Do you like it? I'm determined to attend the theatre this season. I do not mind if I suffer. What's a little discomfort?" Marie-Catherine murmured her agreement. Her daughter had superb taste, she thought, looking at the treasures tucked into various alcoves and nooks around the room. Rather than housing books, Deirdre preferred to read magazines. Her glass cabinets were filled with curiosities from across the seas, spiked shells and faded corals, glistening stones with hearts of blue and yellow crystal, stuffed birds, whose tapering iridescent plumage almost made her eyes water. "This rascal must be a girl. I've such a pain under my ribs. The only food I can keep down is cake." Deirdre dangled her hand over a plate of sweets, swirling her finger as if playing a game. She had inherited her father's looks, her neck long and smooth, broad cheekbones, a pert nose and pointed chin. When not expecting a child, she liked to show off a trim waist, but Marie-Catherine had unfortunately passed on her appetite for sweets. "This gown's a godsend." Deirdre patted her hips. There were secret ties hidden in its folds, she explained, which her maid loosened as her pregnancy progressed. Marie-Catherine had been under the impression that the closer Deirdre came to the due date, the more languid she became. But her brown eyes were flashing beneath her arched brows. "Pierre's tending his mistress. She's also with child." Marie-Catherine frowned. "However do you stand it?" Deirdre chewed on a macaroon. "To the contrary, I encourage him. It gives me free rein here. And," she wiped her fingers on her dressing gown, "much as I imagined having a large family was my dream, do not make a face. It does not quite match the picture I had in mind. I fear I shall not survive another." "It's the pains of the last few weeks," reassured Marie-Catherine. "Your vitality will be back once it's all over. Please do not jest about your health." She was suddenly reminded of Deirdre's vulnerability, of the boredom and the sleeplessness of childbearing. Unperturbed, Deirdre selected a second cake. "You must distract me, maman." "Is there any news of Madame Tiquet?" "I need diversion. I had Louisa Bonville for supper last night, and it was all we could talk about. Neither of us can agree if she's guilty or innocent." Deirdre motioned for the maid to pour tea, watching like a hawk as she set the heavy pot back on its warming tile. "That shameful affair she carries on with her poor Chevalier. They say he never married because of her. I cannot fathom the damage to his reputation." Marie-Catherine paused to arrange her thoughts. "I believe she is innocent. It's tempting to gossip, but be careful of falling into crude speculations. Nicholas had her fair share of trials with her husband. We are confidants, if you must know, and I take her at her word." "But you must have something for my lunch companions." "As to who attacked Monsieur Tiquet?" Marie-Catherine resisted the temptation to snort. "One of her servants has disappeared. Perhaps if you hear something of his whereabouts, you might let me know. He's wanted for questioning." "By whom, you or the police?" Deirdre asked with a frown. "It isn't your way, interfering in someone's affairs. Have I missed a detail?" Marie-Catherine paused, glancing at Deirdre with resignation. "I offered to have her carried out of Paris, if you must know, but she's chosen to stay put." Deirdre glanced over to the windows, the heavy curtains drawn back. "Isn't that fitting? 5 minutes of drizzle, and now a rainbow." She studied Marie-Catherine. "Really? Why would you do that?" Marie-Catherine looked away. "It doesn't matter. She refused and wouldn't give my messenger a reason. I haven't heard a word from her since." She rubbed her thumb with the fingers of her other hand. Angelina had found her a new ointment, which seemed to be working, but she'd forgotten to put it on. "While I remember, I've a message from your papa. Before he repays his debt, he wishes to see you." "I don't like being involved in your squabbles. Can I lend you an écu or two instead?" "I shan't have a daughter supporting her mother. Marie-Catherine leaned forward in her chair, stroking Deirdre's cheek. "Forget I mentioned it. I can invite him for tea, but you know, Papa. You're aware he's ill." Angie mentioned something. A loud cry sounded from the nursery in the adjacent chamber. An elderly nurse, her hair tucked into a white cap, her waist severely tied, rushed through the open door, bearing in her hands a broken china doll. "It's the girls' story time," she interrupted crossly. "They're asking for you." Deirdre sighed. "I should like to take my bath. A woman's coming to rub me all over with perfumed oil, and then I'm to swallow my draught and sleep." She turned to Marie-Catherine, imploring with her large brown eyes. "Might you recite a quick tale?" Marie-Catherine stifled a grimace of irritation. Much as she loved her granddaughters, they had been brought up irregularly. The moment their nurse was out of sight, she would take herself off to the kitchen for a sit-down, if Marie-Catherine agreed to attend them. They changed personalities. Last time she visited, the youngest had kicked her ankle. "If you promise to speak with your father," Marie-Catherine bargained. She would tell an abridged version of Finette Cendrillon, the girl who swept the cinders. Perhaps it would frighten her granddaughters into obedience. Shutters closed. Pigeons flapped their wings and fluttered for cover. Sacks were tossed over mounds of oranges, figs, apples. Smoke plumed beneath the low rain cloud. Marie-Catherine had bought a bouquet of peonies and roses from a hawker outside Deirdre's apartment. "Hurry, hurry," she said to herself, willing the woman to finish arranging the apricot and pink blooms. She was anxious to return home to the comfort of the notebook she planned to fill with an idea just discovered. Paused at an intersection to hail a palanquin, Marie-Catherine studied a group of girls playing a clapping game. Nearby, several boys practiced throwing hoops. Turning into Rue Saint-Germain, she saw that a crowd had gathered, the street lined on either side by excited merchants, market women, fishmongers, waifs, noble men and women. A blast of a police trumpet sounded. She swiveled her neck in the direction of the commotion. The traffic slowly began to part. Horses and carts and carriages moving to the side of the road to allow the passage of the procession. A phalanx of guards, their medieval pikes pointing to the half-hidden sun, marched with pomp and purpose between the street merchants and their customers, obstructing business. Horses whinnied, and drivers clutched the reins of delayed carriages. Coiffed ladies and wigged gentlemen craned their necks, anticipating a glimpse of whatever travelled in the wake of the grand showing of the city's police. It could not be the king, for his pennants would be flying. Marie-Catherine strained to see what was causing the commotion. The guards moved in perfect conformity, feathers bobbing, blue jackets, doublets and breeches brushed and buttoned. Marie-Catherine jumped at a heckle from a group of chimney sweeps standing behind her. Suddenly there was silence, and the squabbling and bartering quelled. She saw 4 black horses on tight rein before an open carriage with uniformed drivers. Seated in a quilted leather chair, looking straight ahead, was Monsieur Lapin, the chief lieutenant of police. Beside him, shackles enclosing her wrists and ankles, a defiant tilt to her chin, sat a well-dressed woman. Marie-Catherine waited, as close to the passing parade as possible, without being caught under a horse's hoof or finding the receiving end of a whip. The woman wore a pale blue bodice and skirt, a pink hat decorated with a single dove's feather. As if Marie-Catherine had drawn her attention by her thoughts, the woman turned her head, meeting her gaze, an invisible skein forming a momentary connection between them. Marie-Catherine felt her neck prickle. She stood in the street, frozen, staring as the carriage moved within inches of her. Nicola's face changed at the sight of her friend, her haughty expression collapsing into panic, pleading. And suddenly, as the carriage moved past and Nicola turned in her seat, leaning out so as not to lose sight of her friend, Marie-Catherine remembered. She was 19 again, returned to the night she had arrived at St. Anne's, terrified the bumpy journey would cause her to miscarry. The carriage had been permitted through the gates to the abbey, led to the stables where the horses were fed and watered. She was hungry, and there was a pain low in her belly. A nun holding a lantern beckoned her through a warren of cold, dark gates and corridors, up winding staircases and along polished floorboards, until she was brought into a warm, well-lit library. The abbess, who was reading in a chair, put her book face down on the side table and nodded at the sister who had delivered Marie-Catherine and her year-old daughter into the room. Deirdre curled into Marie-Catherine's skirt, the rough fabric hiding her face. The abbess bade them sit before the fire and inquired if they needed food. Marie-Catherine did not recall their conversation from that point. All her concentration was directed to remembering to speak the name she had invented, rather than her own. She would glance with feigned humility into the abbess's face, keeping her eyes clear and steady. But the fear that pierced her heart was not invented. Earlier that afternoon, she had returned to Francois's apartment to pack her possessions. Her maids swept powders, jewellery and ribbons into a bag. She asked to be dressed in travelling clothes, discarding her modesty as 2 servants ransacked her armoire, tossing her underclothes, shoes and skirts into a trunk. Deirdre sat on the bed covers, dazedly sucking her thumb. Though it was dangerous to journey in her state, she would take the risk. She felt only relief bidding farewell to the grand apartment she had shared with her husband. The dark panelling, the thick curtains and expensive sheets, stained with the miasma of his detested presence. The red spots of exertion on the cheeks of her lady's maid, her own hands sweating. The girl had almost dragged her out of her bedchamber, down the narrow stairs and outside to the waiting carriage. Deirdre crying now, Teresa turning inside her belly, kicking out a leg or arm, the horses finicky. They left the lanterns unlit, for fear they would be stopped at the city gates and questioned. The farming boroughs wreathed in darkness on the outskirts of Paris. The invisible acres leased by St. Anne's convent, the high walls surrounding its stone fortifications. The whinny of a horse made her heart jump. The forged letters in her purse, the identity she had invented, finessing the scheme in Father Etienne's office. Her first fairy story, how they had refined the plea she would make for refuge. It had been the priest's idea to change her name. Together, they fabricated a new background for her. She was no longer Baroness Marie-Catherine d'Aulnoy, hailed from Barneville-le-Bertrand, a seigneurie in Normandy, daughter of the noble union of her late father, Nicolas Claude Le Jumel, seigneur of Barneville, and her mother, the independently wealthy Judith Angélique de Gudin. Rather, she was an 8 months pregnant widow, arrived in Paris from the provinces with her year-old daughter to begin her life over, following the death of her husband after a feverish malaise. She claimed to have been staying with a distant family in the city, but had fallen out with them, and now had nowhere to turn. Paris's convents were full, and she had spent a night on the street. She had a little money to pay her way if that helped. The closer to the truth the lie, the better chance it might succeed. And she had not made up the detail about imposing upon family in Paris. She had fled the Baron's household on so many occasions that Judith Angélique had instigated the custom of keeping the guest bedchamber made up in her Latin Quarter apartment. Gone. The merchants and shoppers, their carriages and carts returned to business, the distraction of the police parade forgotten. The rain had held off, the sun shining brightly over the crowded street. The sacks and canvases thrown over the sellers' wares were whisked away, as if by some street magician, in a flourish of wrists and hands. Everything was back as it had been when Marie-Catherine left Deirdre's house. With a dread feeling in the pit of her stomach, Marie-Catherine ordered the palanquin bearers to deliver her home without delay. Why had Nicola been so obstinate, so stupid beyond measure? Perhaps it was her friend's lack of experience with the machinations of the state, the merciless cruelty of its cogs' relentless spinning. How did she not realize that Father Etienne's visit was her chance for freedom? Disgust for her neighbours swirled like a sickness inside. How dare they condemn Nicola in their ignorance? Marie-Catherine was not sure where Nicola would be held to await trial, but she could guarantee it would be a far worse place than St. Anne's Convent. Part 2. Angelina, 20th of April. Seated on the cushioned bench of the carriage, Angelina fought a silent battle to keep her hands folded in her lap. After greeting her with a kiss to both cheeks, her neck ran hot and she hoped her skin had not turned pink. Alphonse had apologized for not writing to her sooner. Marie-Catherine's encouragement had made a deep impression upon him, and he had locked himself in his chamber during the past fortnight to work on a story. "A likely excuse," teased Angelina. "I swear on my life," protested Alphonse, holding her gaze, touching a finger to her knee. At least in theory, Angelina had submitted to Alphonse's request that she write to him. She had taken a leaf from Marie-Catherine's book and read her mother's copy of his story, adding a note or two in the margins when she found the writing to be at its strongest. But the exercise left her with a sense of frustration. What did she have to contribute? Her mother had already made her responses in a different coloured ink, and she had little in terms of praise to add. She had tried to write her impressions of Paris's street life for him, but then thrown them into the fire. What did she have to say that he didn't already know, and with far more depth? He was a sophisticate, she a former convent novice. Whatever she might come up with would only expose her lack of experience. It had been weeks since he'd visited for morning tea, and she felt thoroughly disappointed. She thought there was a spark of interest in his gaze, a jot of affection behind his teasing comments. For some unfathomable reason, she found herself needing to impress him. She couldn't seem to argue herself out of the notion. But rather than take a chance and send her thoughts in a note, she had spent her spare evenings penning her heart's disappointments into her diary. In the mornings when she awoke before going downstairs to Marie-Catherine's chamber to help with her correspondence, she felt less desolate and made lists of subjects they might talk about should they ever find an opportunity to start a conversation. There were intellectual topics, such as the quarrel of women, or the arguments of ancients and moderns. They might discuss her mother's wide-ranging literary achievements, though perhaps not. Perhaps the secret rituals of convent life. No. The snobbish Parisian mademoiselles whose company she could not attract. Was it any wonder he had not sought her out again? She had put herself into a bind by rudely ignoring him, but it was only self-protection. Had she shared her paltry thoughts with him, he would have seen all that she lacked, and quickly made up his own mind that there was nothing to be gained from embarking upon a friendship. She had merely saved him the trouble. But that morning, a note had arrived with breakfast. Alphonse was hiring a carriage to pick her up for a stroll in the Place des Vosges. The note was marked urgent. Alphonse's valet waited downstairs, having rushed over from his master's apartment to personally deliver it to Angelina, with instructions to obtain her prompt reply. She had been thrown into a fluster. She needed more time before seeing him again. She had been planning to wend her way into his thoughts slowly, with fine and clever sentences, though admittedly she had not had much success with that plan. And she had not washed her hair. Not that it mattered. Why would she think such a thing? She was not interested in him for romantic intrigue. It was something else, though she couldn't put her finger on what that was. Nevertheless, her thoughts, like little birds after crumbs, fluttered to the way she looked. She had a dress in her closet from Teresa, which she had not yet had occasion to wear. She had a perfume, bought at the apothecary, her first ever feminine indulgence. Perhaps she could rub a little on her wrists. She had not been able to finish her bread and egg. Lise had clipped a new comb into her hair and drawn the waist of her bodice tight with expert lacing. Now, adjusting her position in the carriage, moving herself slightly closer to the door, she glanced out of the window. Her heart had beaten so fiercely after their brief greeting that she had been unable to speak coherently for the remainder of the journey. Stepping out of the carriage, Alphonse offered her his arm, and she felt herself beginning to grow calmer. She reminded herself that this was what young men and women did in Paris. A murmuration of starlings moved in formation above the quadrangle of rich red houses that surrounded the Place des Vosges. The shrubs in the centre of the park were shaped into geometric forms. Here and there a bench for a pair of friends to sit on and share a diverting conversation. It was the first time she had promenaded the city with somebody who was not a blood relative. Teresa had invited her out for a stroll only last week, stopping every few paces to speak to her myriad friends, which had reminded Angelina of those she had left behind at St. Anne's. The unsettled feeling that plagued her each evening when her secretarial engagements were over, when she cuddled her pillow in those last moments before sleep, had returned. "Those girls look like flamingos," said Angelina, determined to distract herself from such thoughts. She pointed to 3 mademoiselles, walking arm in arm with a large parasol held above their heads. Behind them sauntered 3 gentlemen dressed in brushed silk suits. "Not that I've seen one outside a book. Have you?" Alphonse's eyes swept her face, as if her remark was rather curious. "Only once at a party thrown by a marquis. They're very pretty, almost the size of a swan, but a little docile, I fear." "See how they teeter," Angelina said, giggling. Alphonse laughed. "I know. We should try to find a bird for every woman in the park." "Over there, a jay," replied Angelina, directing Alphonse's gaze to a woman with a large blue bow tied to her waist. "And 3 little sparrows," said Alphonse, as a group of convent girls walked past. Angelina's smile fell from her face. She felt foolish. What was she, if not another dull little sparrow? And the slightest attention from a pretty bird, an exotic flamingo such as Alphonse or Henrietta, and Angelina became its most ardent admirer. Whenever Henrietta had entered a room, it was as if the air had shifted and resettled. If she were the one strolling in the park with Alphonse, she would not draw comparison to a dull brown bird. She would be telling a riveting tale about Versailles, which she had visited more than once, describing the spectacular uniforms of the King's Guard, imitating the tone of Louis's morganatic wife, Madame de Maintenon, when she scolded her ladies-in-waiting. "Cat got your tongue?" said Alphonse, affecting disappointment. He stopped walking, blocking her path. "I was enjoying our bird-watching game." "Why did you invite me here?" asked Angelina. "There was a reason," said Alphonse, watching her. He had dropped the note of playfulness from his voice. "Marie-Catherine told me a little of your trouble at St. Anne's. I thought I might take your mind off things." "She did?" Angelina frowned, puzzled. What was Marie-Catherine's plan, she wondered, in revealing her problems to Alphonse? It was hardly the kind of information that would captivate a potential suitor, if indeed that was what her mother had in mind. "I truly am sorry for taking so long to write to you again, after the sweet remarks you made about my story," Alphonse added. Angelina blushed, stammering. "I did little more than copy what my mother said. I was out of my depth, if you really want to know." "That's not what Marie-Catherine told me. She claims you're her first reader, that she sent you all her fairy tales before anyone else. You must have an excellent eye." "Perhaps," said Angelina. "I apologize for being gauche. She touched her cheek, considering how much to reveal. "I'm overwhelmed. I'm not used to male company." She laughed. "And now I'm so pink in the face I want to hide away." "You're safe with me. Though I act the fool, I'm a decent sort. Just be your natural self. It's refreshing." Alphonse touched her arm and met her gaze. A smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I didn't tell you in the carriage because I wanted it to be a surprise, but I've bought us tickets to a musical performance in the cloisters." A quartet was set up in a corner of the quadrangle, and chairs arranged along the length of each side. Alphonse led her to their seats. She remembered the fan she had in her pocketbook and took it out, fanning her face and watching the overdressed Parisians. The musicians, their faces heavy with white powder, were leaning over their instruments, plucking a string here and there. A note from the violinist sounded, and Angelina began to relax. The mild spring day calmed her nerves, and for once she felt as if her attire was appropriate for the occasion. She sent a sideways glance to Alphonse, surprised to discover that he had been studying her. She smiled, hopefully a little coquettishly, waving her fan across her face. She would learn to be a Parisian woman. It would just take time. She closed her eyes, letting the music travel up and down her spine, enlivening her skin, tingling the back of her neck, giving her pretty pictures and geometrical patterns to follow, perhaps inspired by the gardens, the starlings, the harlequin patterns of the women's dresses. A singer joined the musicians, her voice making Angelina's breath catch in her throat. The woman was close to Deirdre in age. She had plump forearms, her sleeves reaching just below her elbows and festooned with white ruffles. She tapped her feet in time to the music in an almost vulgar fashion. Angelina was fascinated. The woman performed with her whole body. It was apparent that she wasn't only entertaining the crowd, that she wasn't simply rehearsing the notes in her songbook, but that every inch of her trembling body was involved. The singer wore thick black ringlets and heavy rouge. Her striped bodice was tightly drawn about her breasts, so that they heaved and spilled, pushing against the fabric. Angelina shook her head and closed her eyes again, trying not to stare at the woman's chest, which expanded each time she drew a breath. Angelina could no longer float along with the rising notes. She had to forcefully distract herself. The fellow seated next to her had a torn stocking and a feather missing from his tricorn hat. A lady wearing a high wig had an ant crawling about in it. A child started to cry and was comforted by its nurse. Alphonse's legs were parted. He seemed relaxed. She wished she could return to the feeling that had begun to spread throughout her body several moments earlier. What was the matter with her? It was worse than the times with Henrietta. When the musicians had downed their instruments and the last of the applause died out, she asked Alphonse if they might walk. "Did you not like the music?" "I enjoyed it very much, thank you. It's another matter." "You may speak of your friend if it helps, the one from the convent." "I can't think of what to say. It would not make any sense, I fear." Henrietta had not been at St. Anne's for long before rumours began to circulate about her behaviour. She tried to make alliances with compliments and gifts, but it was obvious she did not belong. Yes, her spirit burned too brightly, but it was not that. That could be dimmed. She used to pinch herself at dinner, refused to eat her supper, and burst into tears in the middle of Vespers. She was sent to the abbess several times for corporal discipline and spiritual counsel, but nothing seemed to work. The nuns did not know what to do with her. After a while she began to shake her head and rock herself in the middle of lessons, her arms wrapped around her shoulders as if only she were there. Well before anyone else, Angelina had sensed her fragility, her need for protection. "I think of her too much," Angelina said, "but my thoughts are full of confusion." "Can you write to her?" She turned to Alphonse, her throat tightening. "I cannot, I'm afraid. She died last winter." "I am sorry," said Alphonse, regret in his voice. He touched her chin and looked into her eyes. Overwhelmed by the intimacy of the gesture, Angelina quickly glanced away. Her throat felt dry. She threaded and unthreaded her fingers. "I did not know," Alphonse said. "Forgive me for prying. He clasped his hands behind his back. "I was under the impression you were especially fond of her. Your mother only said there'd been some trouble with a close friend. I thought it was a romance between girls. I was intrigued. I see it was a different matter." Angelina froze, shocked at his forwardness. "I'm sorry, your mother—" "Never mind," said Angelina. "She doesn't know the half of it." She forced a note of brightness into her voice. They were heading toward the carriage, the stroll along the breezeway under the palaces settling her jumbled emotions. She tucked her arm into Alphonse's. "I'm afraid I've dominated the afternoon, carrying on about my sad past. I know nothing about you. You must have many exciting experiences to tell me about." "Perhaps," said Alphonse, "though I am best at inventing them in my room, all alone." "I know your kind very well," Angelina said. "On that note, I wish to ask a small favour," he said, as they arrived at their carriage. "If I might request one first, that we pass by my sister's house on the way home. I promised to visit her." "Oh, of course. Just ask the driver." Inside the carriage, Alphonse reached into a bag and drew out a package. "Would you mind passing this on to Marie-Catherine? It's why I've been so quiet. You may glance at it too if you're bored one evening, but I'd really like her opinion." She took the package and stared at it, her thoughts racing. The afternoon contained a promise of the life she might live outside the walls of St. Anne's. But she was confused. Alphonse's attentiveness made her feel cared for. Unlike in her past friendships, he was not forced into her company by communal living arrangements. But with Marie-Catherine in the background, his attention could not be wholly altruistic. A friendship with Angelina would be of use to him, and she was conscious that she must guard herself against being used. In the past she had been too open, too encouraging, and it had led to great pain. He might slip beneath her skin, planting himself in her thoughts before she had even decided if she wanted to cultivate a new friendship. Or, more likely, before she was sure this was the friendship that she should be tending. Closing her eyes, she let out a slow breath, chiding herself for being overly concerned about the impression she had made. "Maman is busy, especially with Madame TK," she said finally. "But I'll see she finds time to respond." Alphonse paused. "They're close, aren't they?" "Very," said Angelina. "The arrest has left Maman quite poorly, but this may be the distraction she needs." An emotion, was it impatience or curiosity, flickered behind Alphonse's eyes. "I'd be most grateful." The door to Deirdre's chamber was closed. The maid issued a sharp knock, and it was drawn open by a capped nurse. Ushered into the cloying room, the fires stoked, the curtain pulled closed, a pealing cry sounded. "She's taken a turn," the maid explained. "She's been asking for you. She's delirious." Angelina had sometimes been called upon to attend births at St. Anne's, and had usually found the mission an ordeal, and not just for mother and child. The sisters administered a maternity ward. Well-to-do families paid handsome sums for the care of daughters who had put their reputations at risk. The convent boarded the women for the duration of their pregnancies, and, should the infant survive, oversaw its adoption into a new family. The girls were then sent home as though nothing had happened, and usually married off as soon as possible. The afternoon spent with Alphonse receded from Angelina's mind like a puff of dandelion seed. "Be calm," she told herself. She whispered a Hail Mary and 2 Lord's Prayers, just in case. "If you might give me a moment," she said, struck by a sudden urge to visit her nieces. The maid nodded. Angelina opened the door to the nursery. "How are my lovely little dears?" she called, arms open to receive cuddles. Her 3 nieces, a set of toddling twins and a dimpled 4-year-old, glanced up from their dolls. The eldest dropped her toy and rushed over to Angelina, smiling to reveal tiny milk teeth, her curly red hair falling in waves around her chubby face. The twins wore identical green-striped dresses. She was sure Deirdre had one of her own in the same print. How strange to spend one's time coordinating the family wardrobe, she thought, a little uncharitably. "Bonbons?" asked the eldest, smiling hopefully. "Of course," said Angelina, opening her pocketbook. She had bought sugar candy at a renowned shop at the Place des Vosges. "You must hide it from your mother, though," she warned. "Maman's having a baby," said the youngest. "That's right, and she needs me to entertain her. So, if you'll forgive me, I'll peep in again before bedtime. But for now, I must leave you with Nurse." "Bye-bye, Aunt Angelina," said the twins. Standing in their long dresses, their identical faces showed opposite expressions. One chewed her nails, eyes downcast at the floor. The other met Angelina's gaze with brazen confidence, as if she might be on hand to help. "I'll see you again soon," said Angelina, backing out of the playroom and its sunny disorder. She readied herself to approach Deirdre's bedchamber. She had to face her sister's trials with calm and strength, 2 things she was not feeling. Drawing in a breath, she straightened her spine and steadied her steps. Her eldest sister lay in a froth of undergarments on the canopied bed. Bolsters propped her knees. She wore a linen nightgown that would surely be cast into the fire when all was finished. Teresa, who had been sitting in a chair beside Deirdre's bed, rose to greet her. "Thank goodness," she said, taking Angelina's hand and drawing her towards the end of the bed. "We weren't expecting anything until next month." "Have you sent for the midwife?" asked Angelina. The straining in her sister's face, her pinched cheeks and glazed eyes, the sweat on her brow, her rolled-up sleeves, all indicated that she was in advanced labour. "She's on her way," said Deirdre. She struck out her hand, which Angelina grasped and squeezed. She took too long to let go. A pain struck, the force of Deirdre's grip turning Angelina's fingers purple. "You should have called for me this morning," said Angelina, not unkindly. "It came on quickly," explained Teresa, "as is the way with Deirdre." Two nurses kept busy rubbing Deirdre's feet and administering her wine diluted with water. Two nuns sat on the chaise before the fire, prayer books opened on their laps. "We thought you might attend," said Teresa hopefully. "Of course," agreed Angelina, though it was not her preference. Give her a broken bone, a cut finger, an epidemic? Anything but birth. "Tell me a story, while I have a mind to concentrate," begged Deirdre. "You may need to pause when I take a pain." "No prayers?" asked Angelina, her eyebrows raised. "God forbid, no," Deirdre groaned. Teresa shook her head at Angelina. "Sorry," she whispered. Angelina sat on the wicker chair on the opposite side of Deirdre's bed. "It so happens I've just been on a walk with a gentleman Maman introduced me to at her salon," she said lightly. "Who's the Dark Prince?" asked Deirdre. "Maman didn't mention a beau." Angelina knew that her sisters enjoyed romantic gossip more than any topic under the sun, except perhaps the antics of children. Alphonse was no beau of hers. The package he had given her had made the nature of their relationship quite clear. But she was willing to play the game for her sisters' sakes. "He pleases the eye," began Angelina. She described Alphonse's richly brocaded jacket, his cheeky manners and quick wit. She told them of the concert, too, of the singer's extraordinary voice, the over-groomed gentlewomen and their preening companions. But she omitted the awkwardness she felt, and the dominant place Alphonse had begun to hold in her thoughts. She presented the episode as a contrivance for Marie-Catherine, which indeed it was. It was just a game, Angelina assured them, and she was enjoying the diversion. "Do not get your hopes up for intrigue. He's a friend, nothing more." "Then, why are your cheeks flushed?" asked Teresa. "He must like you a little. Who could not?" "Writers will entrust anyone with anything, should they profess even the slightest flicker of interest in their work. Surely you know that. No vainer creature walks God's earth, except perhaps a bishop, or a musician, or a poet." Angelina flicked open her fan and struck it back and forth, batting her eyelashes in a parody of coquetry. "It sounds as if he has his hooks in you," said Teresa. "He wishes to ingratiate himself with Maman and improve his standing in the salon community." Angelina sat up. "I'm to be a conduit to whisper sweet nothings into her wrinkled old ear." Deirdre let out a tremendous groan. "I cannot stand it." "Please, dear Lord, spare my sister," prayed Angelina. "Do you have something I might change into?" She touched the embroidered bodice of her borrowed dress. "On a chair near my dressing table," muttered Deirdre. Angelina stood before the enormous looking-glass, taking pins out of her hair. "I'll do that," said Jeanette, rushing over. In a few moments the brocaded skirt and bodice had been unbuttoned, unlaced, and laid carefully over a chair, and Angelina had been helped into a plain dressing gown, the rope tied firmly about her waist. She washed her hands at the ewer, and then turned to address the nurses who were fussing at Deirdre's shoulders and feet. "I need hot water and rags, cloths. She may lose water. Teresa, can you fix the bolsters under her knees better? Push them back like this." Drying her hands on a towel, she demonstrated with her sister's right leg. "All will be well, dearest Dee. She looked gently into Deirdre's eyes, holding her gaze. "You've nearly finished the first part of your labours." Deirdre nodded obediently, and then clutched Angelina's hand, bearing down with a soft grunting sound. Angelina thought quickly. Her sister was nearer to birth than she had realized. She folded the rag she had been holding, instructing Deirdre to take it in her teeth. "Bite down hard." She searched among the draughts and medicines on the side table, hoping to find a painkiller, but the labels on the bottles, sealed with wax-soaked cloths, suggested innocuous ingredients that appealed to the senses rather than containing any effective medicine. One of the nurses appeared with a kettle of hot water. She pushed the cloth into the liquid and squeezed it out, pressing it against Deirdre's forehead. Her sister had broken out in a profuse sweat. Her contractions were coming at short intervals, and with each pain she tossed her head to one side, her eyes rolling back. Half an hour later, with the midwife nowhere in sight, Deirdre, all animal now, was ready to push. Angelina had arranged herself at the end of the bed, affecting all the calm she could muster, though in a secret part of her mind she was starting to panic. Every litany she could think of played with great urgency on her lips. Deirdre rose up onto her elbows, straining, her brows bunched together. She grasped alternately at the hands offered by Teresa and the nurses as she howled and pushed and cried again and again, until Angelina could hardly breathe with fear that the child was stuck in the birth canal. It should be over by now. It should not be so painful. Deirdre slumped back, a long wail echoing in the hot room. The door to the bedchamber opened, and in rushed the midwife, a whiff of whiskey on her breath. She washed her hands and nodded to Angelina, who moved to the top of the bed so that she could reheat the flannel pressed to her sister's head. The sweetest relief entered her soul. "We have news." Angelina blinked as if she were about to cry. "Deirdre's delivered." Mary Katrine drew the blankets up to her neck. Angelina sought her hand, gently squeezing her fingers. "She's well. And the infant? A girl, another daughter. Healthy, fine, perfect in every way." Angelina wiped her eyes. "I almost caught her. Thank goodness the sodden midwife arrived in time." Mary Katrine grimaced, watching the flickering candle Angelina held. Supper time had passed. Though it was not yet late, she had crawled into bed to keep warm. She paused, sighing. "What a blessed relief. I shall have to think of a gift." The time for celebration was upon Deirdre's family. Her sister would lie in for a month, being visited and pampered by relatives and friends. A week's celebrations would be undertaken. Wine, meats, fruits and breads laid out day after day. The infant's lips would be wetted with wine, and her head kneaded every morning for 2 weeks, so it formed a good shape. She would be tightly swaddled so that she might grow up with a straight posture. "Thank you for not telling me it started early," whispered Mary Katrine. She glanced at Angelina, and then looked away. "Though it shames me to admit." "You shouldn't trouble your mind," Angelina said gently. She understood her mother's fears about the perils of labour and birth, but she was aware of a deep exhaustion, her own niggling unease, though, of a different source to her mother's. "If you must know, Maman," said Angelina, "it shames me that all I can feel now still is anger at St. Anne's." Her voice quivered. I wish I could simply be happy for Deirdre, but I can never forget those girls. Forced to part with their infants, the agony of being separated, the money that changed hands so that their families might be rid of the burden. It's almost evil. How can the Church put women through such terrible suffering? All evening I've been overcome with fear and guilt. I barely enjoyed a moment of helping my sister. Indeed, I nearly resented that she called for me. "I'm sorry you see it this way, Angelina," said Marie-Catherine. "You need not upset yourself. Try to put it behind you. Deirdre's child will be showered with love. She's wanted. You've been generous with your skills." Angelina put the candle on the bedside table and rubbed her temple. A sharp pain wriggled behind her eyes. She'd not eaten all day and was painfully hungry, yet food held no appeal. "Might you take care of your maman's troubles?" Marie-Catherine motioned to her feet under the blankets. "In a moment. I must wash first. I'm weary." She began to walk to the door. "Oh, I nearly forgot. Alphonse gave me a package for you. He wanted me to guard it with my life." She shook her head in fond resignation. "It waits on your desk." Marie-Catherine brightened, a glint in her eye. "Oh, yes, your rendezvous. How fares Romeo?" "You're reading too much into it. It's your favour he wishes to cultivate, not mine." Marie-Catherine, the 22nd of April. Marie-Catherine's morning correspondence included a letter from Marguerite de Noailles, in which was enclosed a note from another friend recounting an entertaining game of hide-and-seek played with the Duchesse de Lude. She read the missive to the end, realising only when she unfolded the letter from Marguerite that it was in fact a taste of the manuscript Marguerite wished to circulate at their next salon. Signing off the correspondence, Marguerite made a mention of Madame Tiquet's arrest, venturing her opinion that their mutual friend's case appeared increasingly hopeless. It was difficult to intervene in the machinations of the courts, and she failed to see what they might do to avert a trial in which she believed Nicolas would be judged with prejudice. Marie-Catherine was taken aback. Why, Marguerite must be growing soft. She was surprised her vivacious friend had been so easily disheartened, and suspected her resignation was more a sign of disinterest than any genuine judgment of the case. Marie-Catherine felt very differently. Indeed, Nicolas' incarceration had only made her more determined to help her cause. And with her connections and high standing, she was confident she would find a way to quell the matter. Not that she envisioned a plan just yet, but she was working hard on the problem. She folded the letter back into its envelope, and then turned to her next piece of correspondence, which was from her French publisher, Claude Barbin. She'd been waiting for a report on the sales of her collection of fairy tales, hoping to sign a contract for a second printing. However, she was to be disappointed. Not only was Barbin writing to inform her that he was withholding her earnings from the past year, but he also deemed that she'd not sold near enough copies to warrant a reprint. She put the letter down, her hands shaking with fury. If he'd supported her plan to run advertisements in several leading French journals, as she'd originally proposed, they wouldn't have been in this position. It seemed that while her fairy tales were beloved amongst the salon crowds, they'd not quite made the same impact on the broader public. For some time, she'd considered taking all of her business to her Dutch publisher, Cornelius Alberts, who acted as an agent for her English, Spanish, and German translations. He had a strong stable of French authors and was not averse to risk. Monsieur Alberts funded his literary titles by publishing a seditious broadsheet, Histoire journalière, under a secret imprint, available from behind the counter in any reputable Parisian bookshop. One only needed to ask the right question. The magazine was published weekly in Amsterdam and shipped immediately to France. The anonymous French authors that Albert supported wrote with vigour about their dissatisfaction with the authoritarian regime and their warmongering, spendthrift king. Such risqué writing would never pass the royal censor in France. It went without saying that Albert's was feted and wooed by the city's women and men of letters. In the past, Marie-Catherine had been careful that her criticisms of Louis's regime, principally concerning the practice of arranged marriage and how it ruined the lives of women, did not contain any traceable political threat. She was canny enough to weave her disapproval of the status quo into intricate plots of courtly intrigue set in foreign countries and times or idyllic fairy lands. But then there was her new book idea. If she really was willing to write subversively about French society, Albert's might be a key ally. Angelina had been growing impatient with her. She complained that she had promised her secretarial work, but had produced no pages for her to transcribe, no plots for her to test. Now that Marie-Catherine had a plan, Angelina was eager to begin work. Marie-Catherine dared not admit how vague her notions for the new book were. Whenever she faced her writing desk, she was met with a frustrating feeling of resistance. She simply could not settle into the task that for many years had been her livelihood. The morning's news from Barbin was deeply troubling. While she accepted that her imagination seemed disinclined to delve once more into those magical worlds, she still believed that fairy tales were not merely a passing fashion, and that their audience extended well beyond the salon crowd. Perhaps she should arrange an appointment next time Cornelius Albert's visited the city. He frequently travelled between Paris and Amsterdam on business. It would not be difficult to organise. She folded Barbin's letter and returned it to its envelope. A head pain for another day. She leafed through the remaining pile of letters, the ecclesiastical stationery of the Paris of Saint-Sulpice catching her eye. She took a letter opener to the small, green-sealed envelope. 4 days after Nicola's imprisonment, and there had been no reply to Marie-Catherine's letters to the Petit Châtelet where she was being held. The bouquet of pink and apricot peonies that she had bought on Rue Taranne, which Sophie had propped in a vase above the fireplace, had held their shape beautifully. Looking at them, she tried to imagine the small, crude cell in which Nicola was being kept. She hoped her friend had the sense to pack coin, to pay her way. Marie-Catherine had been corresponding with Father Etienne about Nicola's case. The parish had a connection to the prison. Perhaps, she thought, she should ask him to make an inquiry on her behalf. Smuggle in a letter? She sighed, reaching for her writing paper. "Dear Father Etienne," she wrote, letting her emotions about Nicola's circumstances flow freely onto the page, the lump in her throat dissolving. As she composed the letter, her mind cast about for ideas as to who else might assist in Nicola's case. There was Nicola's brother, Matthias, who was friends with Montgeorges. She would pen a note to him. The siblings were close. Turning to her accounts, she noticed the package that Angelina had laid on her desk. She opened the wrapping. Inside the carefully tied paper sat a manuscript, 100 or so pages long. If she were to believe the title page Alphonse had carefully scripted, he had composed the fairy tales in secret, not airing the draft at the literary salon that dotted the capital as was the tradition. Every collection of fairy tales that had been published in the past several years had first been tested in manuscript form by a salon audience. She wasn't sure how she felt about this tactic of his. Perhaps it did not matter. She drew a fresh candle out of the storage drawer and pressed it onto the stub of a candle holder. She settled in front of the fire, her feet resting on the chaise, to read the first story. Within a few paragraphs, she was determined to learn the fates of Alphonse's heroes and heroines. By lunchtime, she had read most of the slim manuscript and was opening a bottle of green ink, scratching notes in the margins. When Marie-Catherine laid down her quill, it was nearing 9 in the evening, and apart from a small nap after lunch, she had worked steadily on Alphonse's tales. She scribbled edits, rearranging sentences, offering suggestions for revised endings or opening chapter paragraphs. His version of the Three Spinners veered a little too closely to Marie-Jeanne L'Héritier's Ric-Din Ric-Don. What might he add to the story to make it more authentically his own? Although it was difficult to achieve success in this world, she believed she held the work of a genuine writer in her hands. Might she help him to realize his ambition? She went to the fire, standing before the hearth and squeezing her fists open and closed. As usual when she was absorbed in her work, she had lost awareness of her surroundings, her hands and feet grown cold with cramp. Her fingers had swollen, the bands of her rings causing the skin to itch and throb. She glanced at the disarray of papers, cups, plates, letters, jewellery, notes and pens that littered every table surface in her chamber, searching for something to help ease the pain. A scoop of pale yellow cream, and she had wriggled the rings free. On the mantelpiece, she spied the elephant statue Nicola had gifted her for her birthday. She picked it up, felt its weight in her hands, wondering if the stones embedded in its design were precious or just coloured glass beads. Pressing a tiny switch at the back of the elephant's neck flipped a catch and caused the device to open, as if the creature were raising its trunk to give a trumpeting blast. She dropped the rings into the elephant's velvet-lined belly and snapped the object closed, then put it back on the shelf. If she had the nerve, she could solve several pressing financial problems with a short trip to the pawn shop. But no, it was best to wait until Deirdre had spoken to the Baron. There was enough to worry about. With Father Etienne failing to persuade Nicola to act in her best interests, and with Marguerite apparently unconcerned about their friend's plight, Marie-Catherine needed to find another ally. She was determined to see Nicola freed.
This ends CD 4. CD 5.
Marie-Catherine visited her favourite patisserie the following morning, on Rue Saint-Germain, purchasing one of the chef's famous asparagus and salmon quiches. Earlier, she'd had cook fetch a bottle of red wine from the cellar and arrange half of the apple tart baked that morning into a wicker basket. Beneath the plate, covered by a cloth, she had packed Alphonse's manuscript as well as a notebook into which her ideas for revising his collection of fairy tales had spilled. She would surprise him with a visit. Monsieur Apéride's doorknob was a brass hand, which issued several dull knocks when she struck it. Marie-Catherine asked the stooped servant who answered to fetch Alphonse, and a flash of heat lit the fellow's lizard-green gaze. He held up a long, thin palm, told her to wait outside, and, without further ado, shut the door in her face. Frowning, Marie-Catherine stepped back from the tiled entranceway. She placed the wicker basket down and surveyed Alphonse's street. Next door to Alphonse's residence was a shop, a perfumery. Marie-Catherine held her gloved hand above her eyebrows and peered into the glass windows. She spotted hand-painted porcelain figurines, hollow inside, and fitted with tiny, gold-capped cork stoppers. There were perfume bottles in amber, blue, green and clear glass. There were containers shaped like books, some carved and painted with oriental lacquer, some cut from alabaster, marble, ivory. The range made her eyes bulge. If she had funds, she would march herself inside and order Deirdre a gift. Help her to find her way back to feeling like a woman again. In fact, what was stopping her, she wondered. It was a special occasion, important enough to trump such thoughts of economy. There was really no excuse. She pushed open the door, hearing the welcome tinkle of the bell as she stepped into the shop, breathing in the exotic-smelling air. Standing at a display of porcelain perfume bottles in the shape of miniature animals, monkeys, birds, dogs and cats, she spied a purple fish, its tail wrapped around a basket of grapes. She was not sure what the symbolism meant, but found the piece utterly delightful. At the counter, pushing away thoughts of her reduced finances, she stood waiting for the gift to be wrapped when she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to face Alphonse. "I thought I might find you in here," he said, smiling. "Isn't it wonderful? It's only been open a few months." He had the handle of her basket tucked into the crook of his elbow, making a joke about street urchins running off with a bottle of vintage wine she had packed. She followed Alphonse out of the shop to his apartment. He rented a single room in the expensive district of Saint-Germain. 2 fireplaces, one for the kitchen and one before which a chaise longue and chairs were arranged, a curtained bed and a duchess with a large mirror, wardrobes, a small round dining table and cane seating. A Persian rug festooned the tabletop. The bookshelves were crammed with titles and objets d'art. There were lamps and clocks and vases everywhere, and nesting tables. A superb still-life painting that caught her eye, a meal of fish, bread and lemons, hung on the wall above a compact writing desk and a hard-backed chair. "Am I your first reader?" Marie-Catherine began, using her best salon voice. She felt embarrassed. They would have none of that. Alphonse was no audience member or fawning patron of her salon. He was her kind. "You are," answered Alphonse. His fingers disappeared into the folds of his necktie, which he was fiddling into a complicated knot. Wig and hat boxes and holders to keep the shape of his boots were stacked against the bureau, and, draped on the wooden railings of his bed, were several pairs of coloured woolen stockings, drying or airing, she was not sure, which Alphonse had forgotten to conceal, an endearing oversight. "This is unusual," she said, reaching for a tricorn hat sitting atop a wig shaper. A bright blue parrot's feather had been struck into the brim. "A gift from my mother," said Alphonse, glancing at his reflection. "It's fragile. Mind you take care." She leaned on her cane, walking slowly towards Alphonse's bureau. He made a sudden move with his foot, kicking at the dresser, which attracted her attention. A glimpse of blood-soaked night rags in the chamber pot. Marie-Catherine looked over to the valet, who was setting out a cloth, plates, cutlery and glasses on a table before the tiny fireplace. "Some wine, perhaps?" suggested Alphonse, studying her. She met his eye, but not before stealing another glance at the base of the bureau, where he had hidden the bloody rags. "Interesting." A slow smile touched her lips. She decided that she would let Alphonse direct the course of their meeting from here. She was certainly interested in what he might have to say. Settling in the chair opposite Marie-Catherine, Alphonse straightened his back and waited as the valet shook out a serviette. Wine was poured, the asparagus quiche quartered and served on hand-painted plates. "If you'll excuse me one last time," said Alphonse, calling the valet back from the kitchen with a flick of his index finger. The fellow nodded, moments later departing the room on an unspecified errand. Alphonse touched the rim of his glass to hers, effecting an awkward toast. He almost gulped the first mouthful of her expensive wine. So many questions arose in her thoughts. She needed to know more about his family. It didn't matter if he had crawled out of the gutters, as long as he was capable of reinventing himself. The world of letters was a meritocracy. Were he born in prison, his mother a murderer, he might still find a place, should his stories tickle his audience's fancy. "Tell me, Alphonse, and please speak freely, for I hardly know anything of you. Where did you learn your skills?" "I've been writing since I was able to cut a quill. As a child I used to play the intrigues of my mother's noble friends over in my mind. I was good at listening behind doorways and playing quietly in a corner. Nobody had any idea I was taking everything in, digesting and rearranging it to my satisfaction." Marie-Catherine murmured her approval. The hot fire inside the small room, all the windows closed, was starting to make her feel uncomfortable. Her feet throbbed inside their tightly laced boots. It was inconvenient, but she needed a favour from Alphonse. "Do you mind if I remove my boots and put on slippers?" She felt as if she were gasping for breath. "I have an affliction." Why had he dismissed his only servant? How on earth was she to take off her boots by herself? With a deft movement, Alphonse was at her feet, untying the laces of her boots with tenderness. He had a light touch. She waited, feeling self-conscious and awkward, for him to finish. "Thank you. Your man makes the fire too hot." She told Alphonse to reach into her bag, beneath the apple tart for dessert, where she had packed his manuscript. He laid the pages on the table, expectant. "I'm curious. Why did you approach me?" began Marie-Catherine. Alphonse considered his response. "You're my model." "There's no need to flatter me. I'm impervious. How might I help you? What do you want to do with the manuscript?" Alphonse glanced at the floor, shrugging his shoulders. "I wrote it to impress you. I got carried away by what you said about my salon story. I penned it all in the past few weeks. Fairy tales are not really the style I wish to write in, but you quite inflated my sense of myself." Alphonse moved in his chair. "I want to write a novel, like your other books. I've been reading The Prince of Carency. It's wonderful." "Is that so? Then why have you written a collection of fairy tales?" Alphonse rubbed his hair. "I suppose it's the vogue. I have a notion they'll be easier to publish." Marie-Catherine gave a rueful laugh. "I thought so too, but I'm beginning to wonder if that's true. It's such a new style, it's hard to know what translates from the salon into the hearts of ordinary readers whose tastes might not be the same." She batted Barbin from her thoughts. She told him that her best-selling book had been The Lady's Travels in Spain, not her novels, as he seemed to imagine. The material had been composed from her mother's letters detailing courtly intrigue in Madrid and a little private research. "I didn't have to make it up from scratch," she said. "The exotic settings and customs alone were enough to enthrall readers." "There's no other book quite like it," said Alphonse with enthusiasm. "Of course, I'm a great fan." He moved forward in his seat, regarding her. "Have you considered writing a sequel to The Prince of Carency?" Marie-Catherine sipped her wine. How close he veered to her thoughts about taking a new direction in her writing. She was tempted to admit the weakness of her ill-disciplined ways to him. She had maintained her facade for so long. telling everyone that her new book was coming along wonderfully. Only Angelina knew she was spreading bald-faced lies. "I did. My patron, Princess Conti, requested a second instalment. How interesting that you should ask about it too. I'm happy to edit your stories. It's a pleasant distraction. But if you want a patron to help you obtain a royal privilege, if you really want a book out, you'll have to find somebody else. I don't think my position is high enough." "I have someone in mind," said Alphonse. "I'm glad you've given it thought. Before my first book was published, The History of Hippolyte, I had to obtain permission from the royal censor to call myself an author, though not for that title." Marie-Catherine gave Alphonse an intimate glance. She lowered her voice. "I had to prove myself to the authorities. I'd had a wild youth, and they needed me to repent my sins. I don't know if you read my devotional books, Impressions of a Penitent Soul and A Soul's Return to God. Terribly sentimental, I know, but quite deliberately so. You would do well to think about how to present yourself, should you have a secret to guard." She looked meaningfully at Alphonse. "I do recommend cultivating a friendship with a member of the high aristocracy. Send them a copy of the manuscript with a personal dedication. I was fortunate in that Princess Conti quite enjoyed my little pamphlets." Alphonse swirled his wine in his glass, thoughtful. Marie-Catherine sat forward in her chair, her eyes bright. "What do you like about The Prince of Carency?" "Well, there's so much. The plot, the criticism of the realm, the despicable behaviour of the characters. That its story derives from people who really existed, not some fantastical fairy island." He stumbled, looking timorously at Marie-Catherine. I love your fairy tales, of course, only—" "You're interested in history and politics?" "No more than the next person. I'm finding my way. Fairy tales, poetry, they're a good starting place, but real life, surely there's no more challenging subject to tune one's mind to." "But I set my works in courts from 100 years past, and in distant countries." "But the book's concerns are from the life you live," said Alphonse. "I'm not interested in writing about myself, if that's what you imply. Storytelling's an escape, a place I visit. My own troubles are too uninteresting to share with the world at large, though that's a path taken by many." Marie-Catherine paused, thinking. Might she confess her daring new idea to him? Leaning forward, she dropped her voice to a whisper. "This is strictly between us," she began, "but I'm going to write a novel set in modern France. It will be a great change in style for me. However, I'm ready, and the time is right. Angie thinks it's a grand idea." "Oh, yes," said Alphonse. "It's a brilliant notion." He looked into her eyes, as if he were about to reward her confession with one of his own. "If you must know, I'm interested in telling the stories of others' exploits and intrigues. That's what truly fascinates me. But you've put your finger on it about protecting yourself. My private life's my own affair to guard." "You must be careful," cautioned Marie-Catherine. Alphonse had no understanding of what it would take for him to transform from popular salon conteur into a published author, however sophisticated his ideas or how prettily his words read on the page. There was an immense chasm between a manuscript gaining the approval of one's circle of friends and its being typeset and reproduced, bound inside leather-wrapped board, and offered for sale in Paris's bookshops. Perhaps it was time to mention the reason for her visit. She had thought Alphonse might prove useful in her fight to rescue Madame Tiquet. If he had something to guard, then all the better. She might strike a bargain. The valet returned from his errand, a bottle of fine wine under his arm. Alphonse made a fuss of removing the cork, insisting they had much to celebrate. Once they'd taken a glass and the apple tart was finished, she asked if she could trust his discretion. "For you, Baroness, anything." Relieved, she explained the trouble she'd been having getting any correspondence from her friend Madame Tiquet, incarcerated in prison. "Have you thought of visiting her?" Taken aback, Marie-Catherine shook her head, her hand at her throat. "I have a horror of prisons. Would you be willing? It's no place for a gentlewoman." "Perhaps, under the right conditions, if you had no other person to help you," ventured Alphonse. "I have no real desire to go to the Petit Châtelet either. My need of adventure is satisfied reading by the fire." "I understand. I'm sure I shall find a way for you to help. I'm merely sounding out loyalty in my circle of friends." "Well, if that's the case, you can count on me," said Alphonse. "I hope you're sincere. I've heard it before," she said gravely. "But I shall think of something. A petition, perhaps, reminding the courts of Madame Tiquet's high standing." Marie-Catherine shook her head. "We've not turned a single of your delightful pages. I've made some notes on the margins, which you may read later. You've written a fine collection. There's much in it to admire. But I wonder, is it quite finished? I do hear what you say about writing a different sort of book, but might you first work further on what you've started?" "While I have decided to take a rest from writing fairy tales, I still deeply admire the style. In my Contes des Fées, all the stories coalesce around the white cat. What would you say to inventing one more tale? One that brings out your feelings about a topic you hold close to your heart?" "I think that's a fair suggestion," observed Alphonse, a brow arched. "An author must be brave," said Marie-Catherine. "You can say whatever you like in your writing. It's your opportunity to reimagine the world as you would have it turn. As for protecting yourself, you'll find a way." As she spoke the words, she wondered if they were for Alphonse's benefit or her own. Nicolas, the 24th of April. The medieval fortification of the Petit Châtelet gated the Petit Pont, a stone curtain controlling passage from Rue Saint-Jacques, the old Roman road to the south, to Ile de la Cité. A week earlier, while waiting for the portcullis to be raised, Nicola had turned her head to study the ships, sailed from London, Venice, Amsterdam, bearing their wrapped cargoes of sugar, linen and silk, the raw ingredients that would be baked and sewn into exquisite luxuries by Paris's artisans. The carriage had slipped beneath the stone archway and turned off the path into a loading area. Her hands tied behind her back, she had been hoisted off the conveyance and made to stand. She'd blinked, waiting for her eyes to adjust to the darkness inside the stone corridors. Gates had rolled open, a stench billowing out that she no longer noticed. Nicola shuddered at the memory. She had surrendered her fine clothes for clogs and coarse stockings, a flax blouse and skirt. Damp beneath her shoes, she had been marched through long corridors to join the women of the lower ranks, hollow-eyed, foul-tongued, several of them wretchedly pregnant. Their stone-walled cells were windowless and guarded by female wardens. The prisoner in the cell beside Nicola's explained the protocols, whom to pay, and the crimes of her neighbours, who were baby killers, prostitutes, thieves. A chamber pot, a straw mattress, a grey blanket, a spoon and bowl and cup. On the second day, she asked for another candle. On the third, she refused to eat the weak soup and dry cheese served with hard bread. On the fourth, she slept for several hours without interruption. When supper arrived on the fifth day, she abandoned her dignity and asked if she might be allowed to write a letter. No. A nub of tallow, a Bible, a stinking horsehair pillow, muttering from the madwoman, sobs from the baby murderer, singing from the young putain. Shrieks. The latter were hers, she discovered, waking in sweat, her heart racing from a nightmare. She prayed before the candle, hands clasped, verses and psalms on her lips. On the sixth day, the portly matron, the woman who took the bribes, entered her cell with scissors to clip off her hair, to prevent lice, she was told. Of all the humiliating stings she had endured, perhaps this was the most sharply felt. She remembered Saint Teresa, whose confessions she had admired as a young girl left in the care of her elderly aunt. How the saint's firmness of will, her blazing visions had inspired her. Saint Teresa sought out physical deprivation, welcoming her punishments. But Nicola had never cultivated devotional strengths. Her closet of shoes, her cupboard of wigs, the party she had organised for Jean-Paul, the date now past, her novels and books of verse, her wine collection, her love of betting at cards, her collection of gloves and tins of face powder, her 100 coloured stockings. Pictures, like portrait paintings, drifted in and out of her thoughts. Montgeorges, his face shining with sweat, returned from the royal hunt, the heads of 2 grouse peeping from his green velvet brace bag. His eagerness to pluck the feathers himself. Claude, home for supper, a bundle of council papers stuffed into his bag, a tit-bit of gossip about Madame Bellet's unpaid accounts to share. Clotilde, arguing for permission to raise a robin chick in the nursery, the milk-wetted bread and honey she charmed the cook into providing. Nicola smacked her knees and calves, listening in satisfaction to the sting of her flesh being slapped. The red lumps and pin-prick bites she scratched raw, her skin rising in welts, the grease and dirt beneath her fingernails and inside her ears. She mistook a rat's chewing for a bird twittering on a branch in her garden, the clicking of matron's steps for the sound of horses' hooves, a carriage drawn up to the front door of her townhouse, a pounding on the wood and iron door for a message from Jacques that her dressmaker waited in her chamber with a stack of fabric swatches for her to inspect. But Jacques had run away. Marie-Catherine had assured her she would do all in her power to help, but she had heard nothing from her friend. No letters or notes. Perhaps it was her jailer's fault. Perhaps they were interfering, keeping the world and its news from her, for their own purposes, to deepen her punishment. There was never any conversation to be had from the other side of the door, only the tray on which her single daily meal was served. She rushed at it like an animal, for it was day 7 and she was starving. Pressing the bread into her mouth, she tried to soften the substance enough to swallow it. No butter, no jam. Touching the walls, wiping her fingers along the corrugations in the pick-chipped stone, stroking her hair. A wound on her skull, touching it, peeling off the scab, feeling the wet blood. Smelling her hands, pinching her fingers together until the red substance grew sticky. "You have a visitor, madame," announced the fat matron. her hazel eyes unblinking, a prominent mole on her cheek. Nicola faced the cell wall, waiting as the lock was turned. Her heart quickened. She recalled the discarded cap under the pillow and drew it out, pulling the thin cloth over her scalp. Whoever it was, they must not see what they had done to her fine hair. "Half an hour," said the matron. "In you go. Don't be scared now."
Maman!
Jean-Paul stood inside the door, Marthe behind him, but rather than move forward when Nicola answered his cry with teary eyes and opened arms, he shrank behind Marthe's skirt. "Come now, it's me." She glanced at Marthe for reassurance, to find her friend's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyebrows drawn into a deep frown.
"What have they done? You look a fright."
Nicola protested that her situation could be far worse. She had forgotten her deprivations already. She had visitors. She stepped forward to kiss Marthe, but her dear friend shrank away as if Nicola smelled. Embarrassed, Nicola turned to Jean-Paul instead.
"A cuddle for Maman?"
Having overcome his initial trepidation, he launched into her arms, streaky tears running down his cheeks. She clasped her fingers around his trembling shoulders. She had failed him. Her life's work, putting him before other concerns, her sole desire to protect him from harm. Claude criticised her for coddling him, ruining him, which had only made her rage. It was true that since her daughter's death 3 years earlier she had kept him close. Occasionally, when she could not admit her daughter was gone, she had made him wear one of her gowns. Her son was compliant, docile, kind enough to allow the indulgence. Once Claude discovered him dressed so, and unleashed his temper on the dinner platters before throwing down his napkin and leaving the room. He would get nowhere with such loss of control, and it only made her draw Jean-Paul closer. She felt a twinge, and then a thumping guilt for how she had betrayed her son. Doing up his shoes, dressing him, overriding the nurse's instructions and forcing her to wait on him hand and foot, bringing him up to be God knew what. Not a powerful publisher like her father, not a common man of the law like Claude. No, she was training him to be a profligate, the most despicable type of young fellow imaginable. He was a soft boy, nothing like Clotilde, who might have been anything she set her mind to. Jean-Paul had been trained in music, languages and history, but he had not shown a passion for learning. Rather he liked cuddles, bonbons, petting the cats, shops, pampering. She had created a miniature Nicola. Her daughter, on the other hand, had plans at Jean-Paul's age to be an actress in the theatre, a singer, an artist, a painter. She offered her attention to a wide range of subjects. She invited the assistance of her nurse and tutors. They would do anything to help realize her charming notions, delighting in fitting her out with costumes and props. Clotilde had applied her wit and intelligence with diligence and love, practicing plays with her dolls, dressing up, running a school, collecting rocks, examining birds' nests, lost in her imaginative play. She had not lived long enough to settle upon a single interest.
"Are you in trouble, Maman?"
ventured Jean-Paul.
"Come now,"
said Nicola, forcing levity into her voice.
"I expect I'll be here another week at most. They'll find the culprits who hurt your father, and I shall be set free."
"I've coin to spare, Maman. Nurse told me. I'll give it all to you."
"Dearest boy. What else has Nurse said?" Jean-Paul glanced at Marthe.
"Nurse is gone,"
he whispered.
"Gone where?"
asked Nicola, studying Marthe. She stood next to the bed, moving the beads of a rosary between her fingers.
Marthe held out her hand to beckon Jean-Paul. 10 servants have run off, including the nurse. Nicola patted Jean-Paul's hair. Well, that's no problem, is it now? You may look after my dear boy. There's enough room in your home. Would that please you to have a child to care for? You know how fond I am of Jean-Paul, Marthe said with a note of reserve in her voice. What about Beatrix? Her maid was steadfast. She's with her sister's mistress, replied Marthe after a pause. She's been appointed a maid to Madame's 16-year-old daughter. She's wary. No one knows what to make of these events. And the police guards I've spent all my coin on? Still guarding the seal on your apartments, said Marthe. The last of the funds you gave me are almost spent. I packed you a few bits and pieces. Oh, Marthe, I'm very grateful. Nicola felt her eyes brim with tears. Be strong, she silently commanded. Marthe felt inside her gown, removed a small drawstring pouch and passed it to Nicola. Fresh undergarments, soap, and a bottle of her sleeping draught. No writing materials? Asked Nicola. They are forbidden, said Marthe hesitantly, as if she were keeping something from her. Her posture was rigid, her features strained. She was no more the cheerful, card-playing and wine-imbibing partner Nicola remembered. She kept herself at a distance, as though she were the one being harmed. Nicola recalled, not a month ago, the lengths Marthe had gone to, in her attempts to shake her out of a poor mood. "You have a pet," said Jean-Paul, rushing to a corner of the cell and crouching down on the floor. "Do not touch it," said Nicola, grabbing Jean-Paul's arm and covering his eyes with her hand. A rat hissed from behind the chamber pot. She asked Marthe to tell her what she could about Claude's condition, learning that her husband remained under the care of his relative. He was mending well, his wounds undressed. The surgeon gave him daily bleedings and purges. A clanking sound as the chamber pot turned over. "What was that for?" she asked Jean-Paul, who had delivered the kick. "Maman will have to clean the mess." Jean-Paul folded his arms across his chest. He began to cower, his lower lip jutting out. "Father wants me to live with him." "And what do you make of that?" asked Nicola. She looked to Marthe for explanation, as Jean-Paul's features twisted in confusion. Her friend would not meet her eye, but unwound the rosary from her fingers and placed it next to the candlestick on the tiny table beside the mattress, near the Bible and the bottle of sleeping medicine. She folded the undergarments and placed them under Nicola's pillow. She removed a handkerchief from her bodice and wiped her hands. "It was my idea," she explained, a firmness to her voice. "I've written to Claude, and he's agreed." "Very well," said Nicola, concealing her disappointment. On the day of her arrest, she had given the remainder of the money she had taken from her banker to Marthe, asking her to take Jean-Paul into her temporary care. She had provided enough funds for her to pay the nurse. It had not entered her thoughts that Marthe would refuse the care of her son. She had no children of her own, and a secret part of Nicola had been jealous of the time they would spend together. She felt a selfish fool. She had not given a wink of thought to her son's care, because a part of her believed that each day she passed in the cell was to be her last. Her ears were constantly trained to the warden's bootsteps. She had believed it was only a matter of time before they unlocked her cell and spoke the words she'd been waiting to hear. Claude had dropped the charges, and she could stop paying the police lieutenant the exorbitant fees he demanded to guard her home until her return. She would speak to her bankers, arranging a truce, drawing up a financial agreement to appease her husband. "Has Claude written of petitioning Parliament for my release?" "He was the party attacked," said Marthe. Nicola sighed listlessly. "I had thought he might defend his wife." She sat on the straw mattress, weakened. She could not stand unassisted for any longer. She rubbed her dirty fingers along the moth-eaten blanket. The cell for a moment blurred into double, as if the walls were closing in on her. She drew in a painful breath, her chest uncomfortably tight, and placed a hand against her forehead. "I imagined he'd relinquish the gripe he has with me." She patted the mattress for Jean-Paul to sit by her. He obeyed, and she snuggled him under her arm. "Might you take him a little while longer? I'd be ever so grateful." "My sister is ill," said Marthe. "I did write, but it seems you've not been given the note. I must leave Paris." "I did not know you were fond of her."
"It's my duty," protested Marthe. "Do not do this."
"What of your duty to me?"
Marthe spoke in a worn voice.
"It's best for Jean-Paul that he's turned over to his father's care."
Nicola kissed Jean-Paul's hair, nodding.
"Yes, you're right. And I thank you, truly, for taking the trouble to bring him to me. I'm so very sorry if your reputation has been dragged into the dirt by way of our association."
"I shall always be your friend," Marthe said.
"If you might be so kind as to do one last thing for me," asked Nicola, her voice growing thin. "Might we say a prayer together?"
A heavy hit rattled the door to the cell.
5 minutes, called a voice.
They joined hands and closed their eyes. Afterwards, Nicola held back tears as Jean-Paul moved away. What foolishness to imagine she would again share breakfast with him, chide his early morning grumpiness. She stood facing the wall as she was told to, while the warden unlocked the door. Marthe and Jean-Paul's footsteps disappeared down the long, echoing corridors, followed by catcalls from the other prisoners. Nicola blew out the candle and lay down on the bed, closing her eyes, shutting out the swearing and yelling, the tiny shifting movements of vermin. The beams of timber that did not creak, the stones that did not shift, for nothing changed here. Hours later she asked for a pail of water to wash in. She prayed with the rosary beads and forced herself to finish supper. Time no longer turned on its familiar cogs. Wakefulness was like an agonizing punishment. She would think a moment more on the soft, warm cheeks of Jean-Paul, his neat suit and polished boots, his hair that smelled of soap. She reached for the draught of sleeping medicine on the small table. In time the matron would return to bargain her out of it. Removing the cork from the stopper, she drank the bitter liquid inside. Angelina, 28th of April. 2 uniformed police guards were stationed at the carriageway entrance to Nicola Tiquet's palatial apartments. The baroque facade inspired by Versailles. Long pikes were held at their sides, as if they might readily strike an interloper. Mustering what charm she could, Angelina spoke to the less intimidating fellow, the one on the right, taking Nicola's coin, which Madame de Senonville had passed on to Marie-Catherine, out of her purse. She was surprised at how easily he accepted the payment, allowing her into the courtyard to await Alphonse, whom her mother had asked to accompany her. Behind the double green doors lay a geometric garden, clipped topiary and a row of orange trees, their leaves glossy in the morning sun. A fountain with a little peeing Eros
featured as the centrepiece. The guards watched through the open carriageway. She felt uncomfortable. A cold wind was stirring, and her clothes were insufficiently warm. An incessant buzzing sounded, and she stood up, listening intently. Near one of the orange trees, a huge bumblebee bumped about, trying to find a flower to settle upon. Just as she was growing impatient and irritated at her mother for foisting the errand on her, Alphonse strode into view. He spoke to the guards and waved at her, skipping a little to hurry his steps. She smiled, despite herself.
I see my mother's made you her lackey. What exactly has she offered you in exchange for this favour, chaperoning me on such a mission?
Alphonse smiled. You think me so cynical. Perhaps I'm simply concerned for Madame Ticquet and wish to support her plight. Angelina blushed.
Of course. I'm glad you've come. It's not a task I wish to complete alone.
She used the keys provided by Madame de Senonville to let them inside the apartments at ground level, passing through a corridor and into a grand chamber. The candles had not been lit, the curtains were closed, and the air was dim and fusty. Along the south-panelled wall, a row of tables had been pushed together for a gathering, set with cloth and china, knives and forks and spoons, and several extravagant candelabra.
Jean-Paul's birthday,
whispered Angelina.
How awful for her.
Who's there? Called a voice. A door on the far side of the room opened, and a portly woman, dressed in an apron and plain shift, shawl and jacket, entered. Behind her, a tall, thin man wearing the livery of a valet. They stood close to each other, bewildered and defiant. The woman, her face red, her nose snub, hair carefully arranged behind her cap, spoke. Madame de Senonville ordered us to let things be, that Madame would be home shortly to give instructions.
When was this?
Asked Angelina, crossing the ballroom. The doorway through which the servants had entered led to a hall off which the kitchen was located. A foul smell lingered in the air. 10 days gone, said the woman. That smell, said Alphonse, pinching his fingers to his nose.
Has nobody taken out the rubbish?
Asked Angelina. We weren't told, said the valet, his face a crisscross of drinker's lines. Angelina inquired about the remainder of Nicola's staff, learning that aside from the police guards, the couple were all that remained of the Ticquet's formerly flourishing household. We've not taken anything, protested the valet. Angelina excused herself, brushing the fellow's shoulder in her haste. She walked down the servants' passageway leading to the storage rooms and kitchen. The rotten stink increased as she neared the larder. The housekeeper and valet followed on Angelina's heels.
Madame de Senonville locked every room except the kitchen and the ballroom. She had those lazy guards dismiss the staff. Still things were stolen.
Nicola's kitchen featured an enormous sooty hearth with several cooking surfaces and a set of Dutch doors that opened onto the courtyard so that deliveries could be made directly into the room. Angelina's eye was drawn to a chocolate cake on the long preparation bench, bugs crawling in the watery turned cream. There were platters of pastries, glacé fruits and custards slipped and spilled onto their casings, wilting vegetables, and, the source of the foul smell, a cheesecloth, from which a fleet of blowflies lifted off, with rancid meat beneath. At the end of the table, a stack of irises, tulips, roses and peonies, which had been left in their packaging, the petals browned, pollen smearing the scrubbed wood.
Go to the storeroom and find the rubbish sacks and cleaning equipment,
said Angelina. She was furious. How could these fools let the flowers rot on the table?
I want this garbage removed before we leave. If you wish to stay here with a roof over your heads, I suggest that you move quickly."
Angelina rattled the set of keys at Alphonse.
"Shall we?"
"You're a little fearsome," remarked Alphonse, playfully poking her in the arm. They were on the stairs, passing the second floor where Monsieur Tiquet had formerly kept his chambers.
"Old habits,"
Angelina replied with mock archness.
"The waste would have given the abbess a fainting spell."
Madame Tiquet's chambers were located on the top floor, down a long wide hallway beyond a small suite given over to Jean-Paul and his nurse. Angelina tried several keys on the ring, finally finding the one that opened the doors. As they swung open, she feasted her eyes upon Nicolas Tiquet's extraordinary canopied bed. Twice as wide as Marie Catherine's was tall, the red and green curtains edged in gold tassels, pressed against the far wall. They had been charged with finding money to pay off the police guards that protected Nicola's apartments, to cover the rent on her cell and privileges in the Petit Châtelet. But it appeared they had a task ahead of them. The room was in disarray. Open boxes scattered over the floor, the doors and drawers of the wardrobes and armoire flung open, underclothes and skirts and shoes left where they had been discarded. Alphonse drew back the curtains. "I need help," he called. It took both their efforts to wrench closed the heavy doors to the balcony. Rain had blown in, soaking the expensive fabric, soggy leaves and fallen branches scattered on the floorboards. "This must be where she met her lover, Montgeorges," observed Alphonse. "I hope it was in a better state when she entertained him."
"I wouldn't listen to that broadsheet gossip that passes for news," said Angelina. "If it were true, it would bode very ill for Nicolas. Maman would never take on such a hopeless cause."
"Perhaps she knows nothing of it."
"I imagine she would. They're close friends. What have you heard about Montgeorges?"
Alphonse shrugged. "That he's handsome, ambitious, perhaps too ambitious to involve himself in such a mess, even if he was able to clear her name. I do not predict a happy ending for Nicolas."
"But isn't that for the court to determine?"
"Do you believe her innocent, though?"
Angelina paused a moment. Did she think Nicolas innocent? Could she go on helping her mother to rescue a woman she believed capable of such violence? "I cannot say. But I do know she was kind to me. Whatever the truth, she doesn't deserve to languish in prison forever."
She began to tidy a set of drawers, folding blouses and putting them away.
"Why in heaven didn't Madame de Senonville have the room cleaned?"
"Perhaps she was occupied with Jean-Paul," said Alphonse. "We should call that rascal housekeeper up."
"I'm not sure I trust her," said Angelina. "It won't take long. We shall do it together. I did my fair share of cleaning at St. Anne's. Nothing's below the station of a novice."
"Was it as terrible as I'm imagining?"
teased Alphonse. "Doubtless it was infinitely worse," replied Angelina. "According to Maman, the coin is in the bureau drawer. Why don't you start there?"
"In a moment," said Alphonse. "I'm surprised there wasn't a fire." He drew a chair under the chandelier, which had clearly been left burning for hours, drips of wax fallen onto the Turkey carpet, and began removing the spent candles. Angelina straightened a gown and took it into the adjacent dressing room, hanging it carefully in the wardrobe. Alphonse checked the bureau, claiming he could not find the money that was supposed to be hidden in its drawers. "But I did discover something useful." He held up 2 glasses of brandy.
"Then we'll be as poorly behaved as that pair downstairs. The fellow was drunk. Did you notice?"
"Don't we deserve refreshment?" suggested Alphonse. He fussily brushed his cuffs. "I'm almost sweating with all this effort."
"If you insist,"
smiled Angelina. She accepted the drink, seating herself before the dressing table, at which Nicolas performed her toilette. "Observe how Quickly I find her coin, she joked, eyeing the numerous drawers. She was fascinated at the treasures they might contain. Sipping the fiery liquor, she traced her fingers along an ivory-handled brush and comb set. She reached into one of the drawers and drew it open, a collection of gloves. She pulled on a pair, emerald green. She found a pot of rouge and smeared a little on each of her cheeks. She drew Nicola's comb through her hair. At the end of the bureau sat a wig box. She prized it open and lifted out a magnificent curled blonde coif, which she placed carefully over her hair. She recalled an afternoon dressing up in Henrietta's beautiful clothes. Henrietta's mother had sent a gown that she was to wear on the day she left the convent, following the birth of her child. But Henrietta couldn't fit into it, and had asked Angelina to model it for her. Henrietta sprinkled perfume on Angelina's wrists, put powder on her chest, and pinned up her hair. Now she was caught up in imagining she was Nicola Tichet, undertaking her daily beauty ritual. She gazed at herself in the impressive mirror, cast from a single piece of glass, large enough, if the viewer stepped back a little, to reflect one's coif, gown, and shoes. "Alphonse," she called, barely recognising herself, looking every bit the glamorous society mademoiselle. "Might I have some more?" She drank the second glass quickly, and was taken with a sudden urge to explore the canopied bed. She drew back a curtain. The bedding was rich and plush, the mattress high off the floor. Sighing, she lay back on the covers, glancing up at the craftsmanship of the canopy. "Ma jeunesse?" Alphonse inquired, holding open the curtain and tying the little tassels. "Your brocade is hideously out of fashion." He giggled. "I wouldn't know," Angelina sighed. Her heart quickened, and yet she felt relaxed, a delicious warmth flowing throughout her body. Alphonse should join her on the bed, she decided, dream a little with her. Nicola's gloves smelt of cloves and frankincense, and, as if protected by the veneer of leather, she reached out a finger, tracing it along his arm. "Lie next to me," she said. Stiffly, Alphonse sat down on the covers. He touched her nose with a fingertip. "Now your hair is rather superb, if a little woolly." She tingled all over, desire like a serpent uncoiling through her body. If Alphonse dared to kiss her right then and there, she would not resist. She closed her eyes, licked her tongue across her lips. Alphonse wriggled his hand out of her grip. "Did I do something wrong?" "No," admitted Alphonse, searching her face. "You've caught me off guard, that's all." She thought of Henrietta, who had let herself into her room, slipping under the covers of her bed, how she clutched and stroked Angelina in desperation. She had been frightened to sleep alone. How the feeling of being needed by someone as vulnerable as her new friend made her experience all the wrong emotions. How she had swelled with a secret desire to touch her beneath her clothes. How wrong it was for her to feel that way. Some demon must be influencing her. The need made her ache. She was pulled towards Henrietta as if a cord bound their bodies together, drawing them ever closer, all the more powerful for its invisibility. "It's not the first time I've been rebuffed." "I don't know what to say, Angelina. Your maman trusts me. I cannot—" "Do not bring her into our conversation," said Angelina, her voice a low whisper of annoyance. She rolled over on the bed, facing away from him. She was filled with a hot shame, which seemed to be transferring into a tormented sadness. In a moment, she could tell it came on like a long sneeze. She would start to sob. She felt Alphonse's hand on her arm. He touched the side of her cheek with his finger, catching a tear. She shook her head on the pillow, eyes shut tight to make him stop. Alphonse climbed up on the bed. He sat on the covers beside her, his back pressed against the wall, legs crossed, sipping brandy. "Do you wish to talk about it?" He offered the glass. She sat up and wiped her face, rouge reddening her fingers. She nodded yes, accepting a sip of the liquor. "I'm a terrible person," she said. "My friend, Henrietta, the girl Maman told you about, was pregnant, and I had the care of her." She began to tell Alphonse about Henrietta's ordeal, the words tumbling from her mouth, a flood of refuse pouring down the cobblestone streets after heavy rain. As the completion of Henrietta's pregnancy drew nearer, she had undergone a dramatic change. Angelina knew that Henrietta would not see her own child once it had been born. She had assisted the nuns several times in such situations. It had been different when Angelina was 16. She had viewed the convent's involvement in forced adoptions as benign, a service even, an unwanted child sent to a good home to be loved and cared for, rather than abandoned to an orphanage. The fees, handsome sums to right unforgivable mistakes, invested back into the convent by the abbess. She had not grown close to the 3 other girls she had attended, had not understood the pain of being made to give up the child that they had carried inside their bodies, made of their blood and flesh, irrevocably bound to their hearts. But Henrietta had been different. After she had delivered Henrietta's daughter, she placed the infant on her friend's chest so that she might say goodbye to her. But it had been a mistake. The abbess entered the birthroom, saw Henrietta holding the child, and wrenched the baby out of her arms. She scolded Angelina. It was not the practice of the convent to let mothers like Henrietta spend time with the babies they were forced to surrender. Henrietta was sent back to her chamber to recover. Her breasts were bound in cloth, and she was told to rest. The infant, robustly healthy, was collected 3 days later from the infirmary by a childless couple, who had paid to have their names recorded on the baptismal certificate as her parents. After the infant was taken from Henrietta, the wound inside her was reopened. She broke apart under Angelina's loving ministrations in her arms. When Sister Agatha, Angelina's confidante, discovered the girl's connection, Henrietta was removed from her care. Henrietta stopped sleeping. She refused to eat, but, most concerning to the convent, she began to speak in tongues, to spit and to froth at the mouth. She rubbed feces on the wall of her bedchamber. She tipped water on her fire and threw off her clothes. She tried to sleep on the floor. She broke the terracotta jug that held her drinking water and took the shards into her hand, tearing them along the flesh of her legs and arms, until the skin split and bled. Henrietta's parents were called to take her home. They arrived tight-lipped, and a terrible fight ensued. Henrietta refused to leave her room, refused to speak to them. Desperate, Angelina visited her in the middle of the night, shocked to see that the rumours circulating about her behaviour were true. She did not really believe in such things, but the evidence before her eyes was undeniable. Henrietta was possessed by a demon influence. A priest was dispatched, a pious elderly man with yellowed eyes and a severe manner, to cast out the evil voices that had taken control of the young woman. Following the exorcism, Henrietta appeared calmer. She convinced the nun in charge of her to allow her to visit Angelina. They spent the evening talking in front of the fire in Angelina's room. Relieved, Angelina kept the fire burning hot, her eyes filling with tears as they spoke. Henrietta told Angelina she had resigned herself to her fate. She thanked her for tending to her during her 6-month stay at St. Anne's, and said she was the best and dearest friend she had ever known. Angelina, feeling optimistic, suggested that they read their favourite fairy tale together for old time's sake. Henrietta agreed, delighted. They sat up reading The Bluebird, Henrietta naming the characters, each a different pawn in the convent's hierarchy. She said that the heroine, Florine's stepmother and stepsisters, were her own hated family, that she was not really related to them at all, that she too had been stolen, like her own child, from her real mother at birth. Alarmed, Angelina hid her growing concern. Aside from Henrietta's conviction that The Bluebird had been written by the Baroness d'Aulnoy especially for her, the girl appeared to be on the path to healing. She had washed her hair, she was clean, she was dressed warmly, she accepted the milk and bread Angelina offered her when they finished the long reading. She even laughed, looking deeply into Angelina's eyes when Angelina assured her that her child had been placed with loving parents, that the girl had the chance of a new life. Henrietta touched Angelina's brow. "Pray for me." She stood up from the chair. "Stay," said Angelina. "The night sister won't report us." "You're a good girl," said Henrietta. She kissed Angelina's cheeks and searched her eyes. "Look after this for me," she said, touching the volume of Contes des Fées Angelina had given her. She did not stop Henrietta from returning to her room, though something in her nursing training had intuited that her friend should not be left alone. She was wary of pushing Henrietta, of making demands upon her. When Angelina had first learned of Henrietta's pregnancy, she had assumed her friend was simply weak, a limp-willed girl who had not learned to control her mind and body. It made her feel superior. But Henrietta had proven herself to be so much stronger, so much more courageous than Angelina had realized. Oh, how false and ignorant Angelina had been, trying to remain in the graces of the nuns by aping their every thought. She knew better now. When Henrietta left that evening, Angelina truly believed that a new beginning had been forged. Henrietta would remain in the convent, they would continue their friendship, but it would be framed by duty, good deeds, and submission to God. Angelina would put her heart and soul into convincing Henrietta she could make a life for herself, rewarding and meaningful and satisfying, in the convent of St. Anne. They need not take every word the nuns spoke as truth. They could find their own way through. No matter how much time it took, she would convince Henrietta she had not been discarded, that she was loved, that she had a place in the world. In the morning, the groundsman found Henrietta's body. Her altered behaviour suddenly made sense to Angelina. What she had mistaken for a new beginning was, in fact, a last goodbye. Henrietta had not gone back to her room after they parted for the evening. She had stolen the keys from the sleeping guard and climbed to the top of the bell tower above the chapel, climbed out onto the slate roof and jumped to her death. How had she been so blind, so willing to believe that a visit from a priest could seal up Henrietta's pain? "I had no idea." "What a cross to bear," said Alphonse, releasing her hands. He had squeezed them steadily throughout her confession, which had served to prize almost every drop of the story from her. "Perhaps you should write it down." "I have," sighed Angelina. "The pages of my diary are filled. I was so angry. I could hardly stand to attend the services, to take communion from the priest." She paused, drawing in a shuddering breath. She raised her eyes and held Alphonse's gaze. "But that's not the reason for my shame," she whispered. "I had an inclination towards her. I loved her." Angelina smiled, tears in her eyes. "But it's a love that has no home, not in the convent, not anywhere." She shook her head. Henrietta preferred men, though, and rejected me ever so gently.
You must not feel that way about yourself, said Alphonse, his voice fierce with conviction. No matter what other people say is right or wrong, promise me you'll forgive your heart for taking its own way.
I try. I do. Thank you for listening, she said. I feel better for having unburdened myself. What power you have, wheedling my secrets from me, but not a word of it to anyone, do you promise? Should Maman get wind of it, she'd turn me out.
I wouldn't think so, reflected Alphonse. Her friend is accused of attempting murder, and for some reason your mother's determined to help clear her name. I think she's a little less conventional in thought than she might seem. After all, she's risking her reputation, which is something she's fought hard to earn.
Alphonse scratched his chin.
Why are they so close? It's a strange friendship, if you ask me. They couldn't be more different. Madame Tiquet is frivolous, such a conformist regarding the expectations of her class. It's hard to really admire that.
They have a long history, said Angelina, unsure of how she felt about the abrupt shift in conversation. Perhaps it's their bad marriages. That seems to unite Maman with certain women. The griping and complaining they all do. They've put me off for life.
But why does Madame Tiquet come to the salons? I see the way everyone looks at her. They seem to regard her as a joke.
The salon's fashionable, and Madame Tiquet adores a part. She even pays for the food and drink, so I suppose Maman feels indebted to her. Being a writer, even a best-selling one, doesn't pay all the bills. Abruptly, Angelina climbed down from the high bed, walking to the dressing table and replacing Madame Tiquet's wig. She could have screamed in frustration. How could she let herself grow confused all over again? She took out Nicola's hairpins, putting them on a dish, efficient, concentrated. She let the prayers repeating inside her head continue without interruption, a sort of incantation. She checked her reflection in Nicola's mirror, relieved that the royal of emotions swaying and swelling beneath her skin did not show. Now, to control her voice.
Might this help?
Asked Alphonse, holding up a brocaded case. Where did you find that?
Under the bed.
He deposited the small chest on the Duchess. Angelina took a cloth from Nicola's handkerchief drawer and wiped the dust from the catch, lifting open the lid. Inside the fabric-lined box was a velvet bag. As she undid the buttons, she could feel something hard inside, a gift box for a pendant or earrings, maybe. Her instinct was right. The wooden case held a bouquet of red roses fashioned from silk.
Look at this, said Alphonse, touching one of the petals.
Diamonds, imitating dewdrops, were mounted on several petals. Perhaps we should take it, Angelina wondered aloud. At least it's something. Maman can have it exchanged.
Their search for money had proven fruitless, nor was there any jewellery. Nicola always made a show of wearing different pieces, in the cases and trays on her dressing table.
Angelina glanced around Nicola's sumptuous chamber, which they had restored to a modicum of order.
The windows and doors secured, they went downstairs to inspect the kitchen. Most of the filth had been cleared away. Unsure what to do about the servants, her mother would have a clearer idea. She allowed them to stay, charging them with maintaining the rooms that were not locked, in Madame's absence. With a stern warning that a burly porter from her mother's household would be over in a few days to check on them. Alphonse insisted on accompanying her back to Marie-Catherine's apartment. Parting from him on the corner of Rue Saint-Benoît, she affected an air of civility and grace. She ignored the ambivalent yearning that threatened to upset her carefully restored equilibrium, turning her thoughts to the report she would make to Marie-Catherine.
This ends CD 5, CD 6.
The porter had been awaiting her return, and she was directed to Marie-Catherine's chamber. Angelina blinked at the unexpected daylight in her mother's customarily dark and stuffy rooms. "Are you expecting a crowd?" Angelina joked. The curtains had been drawn all the way back, as if in preparation for a salon. The chaises longues and chairs pushed against the walls. Sophie and Lise were rolling up the winter rug. How shabby and faded her mother's furniture appeared when compared to the opulence of Nicola Tiquet's room. She could hardly blame Marie-Catherine for keeping the place in perpetual half-darkness. "It's your fault," said Marie-Catherine, giving a tired smile from behind her writing desk. "Making me find all the accounts." "Perhaps you should take a break from trying to write every day. It's making you very grumpy. Surely if an idea comes, you shall recognize it." "That's not how it happens, my dear." Her working area had been completely rearranged, the writing set polished, the empty ink bottles and broken quills removed, the rings from cups and glasses wiped away. Though Angelina begged her to let the maids clean, Marie-Catherine insisted on maintaining a vigilant guard over her personal papers. The accounts, which Angelina could not bear facing, sat in a neat pile under her ledger, a fresh notebook on top. She wished Marie-Catherine would hurry up and invent a new story. For 10 years she had unfailingly sent Angelina drafts with nearly every letter, working without fuss on several pieces at once. Angelina could never understand how she managed to move from one book to the next, as if each story was a carriage, and all she had to do was take the porter's hands and climb the little step inside. Angelina was growing bored of waiting for the editing position she'd been delivered from her former life, her former home, to begin. In especially depressed moments, brought about by the task of making sums, she wondered if there had perhaps been some mysterious method between her mother and her former secretary that enabled her to work with ease, some trait or trick that she did not possess. Marie-Catherine asked how she had got on at the Tiquets. She expressed displeasure, but no surprise, to learn that the stash of coin Madame de Senonville instructed them to recover had disappeared. Angelina offered the box containing the diamond-encrusted roses, relieved to be told she had made the right decision in taking them. Marie-Catherine laid the bouquet out on the leather writing pad, touching it with a tender figure. "We'll have to use this," she said, echoing Angelina's earlier thought. "I don't know how she'll react, but she has no choice. She always feared Claude will steal them back from her." "They were from him?" "Yes, from their courting days," said Marie-Catherine. She narrowed her eyes. "Like the Baron, apparently Claude Tiquet was devilishly good-looking as a youth, charm to burn. I scolded her many a time for following her loins. But she views herself as having been taken advantage of, though she made the bed for herself. But what does one know of the world at 16? If I think harshly of her, it's only in comparison with my own experience. She was made an orphan. Her mother died when she was a girl, and when her father followed a few years later, she was delivered into the care of a senile old aunt. Nicola was accustomed to having her way. She was spoiled and beautiful, and rebuffed all the aging, moneyed suitors that were presented to her. Despite his similar age, not to mention the fact that nobody knew his background, Claude Tiquet convinced her to give her heart to him. He was determined. There was even a rumour he fought a duel over her. But his greatest feat was to present her with a bunch of roses with diamonds worked into the petals. You know Nicola. She was smitten by the novelty of it all. She told me she kept the real ones, dried them out and hung them above her bed, before deciding to have the diamonds made into this piece.
"He loved her once. That's something," said Angelina.
Perhaps he did. But he also saw an opportunity. Not long after Jean-Paul was born, she visited her banker to withdraw money to build a new nursery for him, to discover that Claude had committed a fraud. He had presented himself as a fellow of means during their romance, but it was all show. He had in fact swindled the old aunt to withdraw money from Nicola's own trust fund. He had the bouquet made and provided a small financial gift as well, if I recall, using Nicola's inheritance. Marie-Catherine curled her fingers into a fist. She was never able to forgive him. To make matters worse, some years back, he tried to have her locked up in a convent.
"Why?"
Some spurious charge of adultery.
"Surely that would not be possible."
Marie-Catherine gathered herself, clearly settling in for a lecture. "I'm not sure how much of the law they taught you at St. Anne's," she said, pausing to look questioningly at Angelina, who shook her head, lips tight. "After the Fronde, Louis gave the state excessive powers over marriage. Shameful act. He needs our class's riches to fund all his wars. He certainly doesn't want wives withdrawing their inheritances from their husbands' grips and away from his own war chest. So, a marriage, however poisonous, is to be protected at all costs. There are no grounds for separation. Not adultery, not cruelty, not even fraud. Women are minors in the eyes of the law. Either they are owned by their parents or their husbands." "You are aware that you're still a minor, Angelina? That I could have you thrown into prison for running off with a lover? Not that I should make a joke about such matters. But you must be thankful I have no such designs on your future. Others are not so lucky, married off to the first eligible suitor that can be found. After that, a man may beat his wife and visit half the beds in Paris, and the law will not lift a finger. But should a married woman seek consolation elsewhere just once, a judge will happily send her to rot away in a convent."
Angelina opened her mouth to protest the irony of her mother's strange little sermon. A convent or a marriage, the twin prisons of women's lives. She decided not to say anything because suddenly she was remembering when Marie-Catherine used to visit her at St. Anne's, claiming she had missed her, clutching her fingers through the bars of the visitor's grill, passing her a treat she had bought at the market, a cake that cook had baked especially for her. Her mother's visits left her feeling alone and confused. If her mother missed her company as much as she claimed during their time together, then why did she leave her in the care of nuns, rather than bring her up at home? She used to feel unsettled in the days following one of Marie-Catherine's rare appearances. She lingered at the gate, listening to her mother asking the footman to help her into her carriage. She often traded the cake Marie-Catherine had brought her for a book from one of her friends, or, spitefully, threw it into the rubbish. It was far more pleasant to receive her mother's letters, even if the abbess did steam them open and read them to herself by candlelight, before releasing them into her possession. Their ink was dried and set. She could read their sentences over and over, sleep with them folded under her pillow. They did not evaporate like kisses and fleeting touches through the bars of a grill. "A convent's a community," offered Angelina. "You learn to fit in."
"Yes, but there's a vast difference between being reared and educated by kind, faithful nuns imparting their knowledge, and being sent to a convent against one's will for being a poor wife." "That's true," said Angelina. She thought for a moment. "Don't all these grievances give Nicola a motive?"
Marie-Catherine's eyes snapped up. "No, I don't believe so. She took Claude to court, had herself certified a free woman. After the fraud business, she had their finances legally separated, tore up his entitlement to her money granted by their marriage license. She's a very unusual case. Her independence boils down to her father's will. He had drawn up strict protections, apparently. And the amount of money she inherited helped. 500,000 livres.
Angelina spluttered. "I can hardly fathom such a sum."
"Oh, I can," said Marie-Catherine, gently shaking her head. "Only too well. 1/20 of her worth would set us right for years."
"So you're quite certain that she's innocent, then?" Angelina said. "I suppose such an act would be too base, even if one were desperate, to seek to erase one's own husband."
Her mother fell suddenly silent. Surprised, Angelina looked up to meet her eyes, searching the unfamiliar expression on her face. She couldn't quite read it. Was Marie-Catherine afraid? Almost immediately it was gone. "Well, enough of this talk," Marie-Catherine said brusquely, picking up her quill. "We both have work to do we not?" Marie-Catherine, the 3rd of May. François d'Aulnoy's valet, a fellow of few words, unlocked the entrance to his master's apartment and invited her inside. Marie-Catherine ignored the stale smell. The windows had not been opened in days. Spoiled cheeses, open bottles of cordial and spirits, rancid butter, were cluttered on the kitchen bench. The valet led her to the sitting-room, where she waited to be announced. She was surprised when the Baron did not appear to receive her. Instead, she was beckoned to make a slow, painful trip to the top floor to meet him in his bedchamber. The fire was dying. A croaking voice called the servant to bring a pot of coffee. She found François sitting on a chaise longue, his large, bulky body wrapped in a blanket. His bare feet poked from the edges, their toenails unclipped, curling like those of a wild beast. A wolf. A bear. She sat down on the couch. Feeling squeamish but unable to help herself, she reached over and brought the blanket over the top of his toes. She had not visited the Baron in some time. Until recently she had been faring well enough to be able to lend him money whenever he roused his lazy, miserable hide to the task of demanding a leave. Oh, it was a bitter pleasure to make him squirm. Her coin dangled in front of his greedy paws, a righteous fairy godmother. Though she had to keep her feelings hidden, otherwise he would undoubtedly remind her of the far greater debt she owed him, no less than her life, and would taunt her back with vile names. She had made the mistake once, many years earlier, and learned the lesson immediately. Naively, she had imagined they might put the past behind them and live their separate and indifferent existences. But François took a swindler's delight in outmanoeuvring her. Her estranged husband coughed, a deep rattle in his lungs. She flinched, told herself to calm. Her problems were larger than the ancient war between them. Perhaps his lungs were slowly drowning him. He took a handkerchief from his pocket and spat into it. His servant helped him to sit up. He fixed the stool, the blanket dropping away so that again she was faced with his hideous feet. The man fluffed about, making a performance of seeing to his master's comfort. François's eyes were on her, his gaze like a snake's, unblinking and cold, waiting for her to grow uncomfortable enough to break the silence. She drew her shawl tightly about her throat and pressed her knees together, effecting the posture of a nun. He was the only person in all of Paris
who reduced her so. Old hag, gizzard, harpy, scold. In his presence she lost her proud authority. After all this time, he still made her feel like a small child riddled with guilt. "Come on, then," said the Baron. He tore a hank of bread, digging a 2-pronged fork into a slice of meat. He opened his mouth as he chewed, a piece of vulgarity she knew was entirely for her benefit. She had seen him assume an entirely different persona in the company of men, ingratiating, flirtatious, charming. She drew a handkerchief to her mouth, overcome with nausea. Meanwhile his servant bustled in and out of the room as if she were not there. He brought out a tray filled with all manner of medicines, and began measuring out portions of draughts from various vials. He passed them to his master, who, with rigid discipline, swallowed every drop and draught on offer. "Whatever ails you?" "The dropsy, the waiting disease, the flu, the gout, the lot." Francois dismissed the servant, pressing the plate of meat and cheese towards her. In her purse she had the credit bill Teresa had him sign on their last encounter, and she was determined to have him honour its terms. She repeated the message she had practised, about returning the funds he owed her. No more, no less, only that she would make no more trouble, should he cooperate. "I have not the coin," he replied with effort. "It's all sucked into my thief of a physician's purse. Much as I should delight in funding whatever whim it is you need it for." "Your living conditions suggest otherwise," she protested, glancing at the gilt-trimmed frames and leather furniture, all deep browns and green, very expensive, though lacking a woman's touch. "You know me," he said, in that voice which grated on her nerves. "I like to keep up appearances, as you, my dear, most assuredly do not. In what year did you buy that shawl?" She would not take the bait. He must know that she had not ventured to see him only to chase his debt, a task with so little promise of success. "I have a proposal for you." The Baron wiped his greasy lips, looked hard at her from beneath his shaggy eyebrows. "Go on." "You do not seem long for this world. We are still married. I assume when you go to your grave, I'll receive the moneys that are my due. Perhaps I can wait a little longer in the short term to be given what's mine." "Is that what you think?" asked Francois. He coughed loudly and with visible pain. "Do not count on a golden egg for yourself in my will. Are you stupid?" He sat up, his face growing bright red as he tried to draw air into his lungs. "As is usual, it falls upon me to be the agent of sense. It just so happens that our daughter Angelina has returned from the convent, a fine nurse indeed. I could ask her to have a solution made to ease your pain. I'm not utterly mean-spirited after all." Francois waved at the servant, who rushed over and pressed a handkerchief to his mouth. The cloth came away red with fresh blood. Several moments passed while he collected himself enough to speak. "I'm not averse to help from Angie. She's a fine little woman. I like her very much, despite your efforts to keep her from me. What is it you want?" "You would still have to pay for your medicine. I can put your debt on hold, though I cannot fish into my own reserves to have you die like a king. Angelina is quite the miracle worker. Certainly she's lessened the pains in my feet." "Oh, stop speaking in riddles, woman," Francois muttered. She had his attention. Nevertheless, her hands trembled. She wondered if she was making a terrible mistake. if he were the last person on earth she should approach with her idea. "A dear friend of mine, Madame Tiquet. Do you know the family?"
"Ah, the murderess,"
said Francois, a twinkle in his eyes. "She's no murderess," Marie-Catherine fired back. Again she steeled her will. She'd simply have to put up with his banter.
"Yes, a mere attempted murderer. I know, I'm goading you."
Madame Tiquet is only charged with attempted murder, awaiting trial. But I fear the worst for her. She's abandoned by all who purport to love her. She's spoken of a valet, a Jacques Mouet, who was dismissed after a dispute with her husband. He appears to have a grudge. Perhaps it was he who made the attempt on her husband's life. Marie-Catherine forced her teeth to part, her mouth to reveal a smile, aware how cold her eyes were. "Might you trouble yourself to speak to your nefarious sources, to learn what you can? I'm determined to see justice served in her favour. It's not your affair. I don't need your opinion. And I'll not be tormented by you. This is a business arrangement." "What do you say?" Francois picked at his teeth, inspecting the food that came out and putting it on his plate. "I believe she's innocent of all charges," Marie-Catherine went on. "If you're willing to help me, I can waive your debt. Perhaps you might use your connections to find out about this man. Uncover something to help his mistress's case. He's gone underground."
"You think this is one of your fairy tales?"
"I'm no idiot. I have lived. I have spent my life." Francois held up his hand.
"Save your breath, I'm not interested. I'll consider your proposal, but you must honour your promise. I'd appreciate another medical opinion."
She bundled up the credit bill and cast it into the fire. He expressed no thanks for her offer of care. Rather, she was treated like one of his unsavoury associates. The deal was agreed to, and he had the servant show her out. Grasping the railings of the staircase, making her slow journey to the lower floor, she listened to him coughing. She would await his communication. She wiped the sweat off her face. Breathing heavily, she tightened her shawl and blinked into the noon sunlight. Marie-Catherine directed the palanquin bearers to a nearby street, where the pawn shops clustered together, and requested they make a stop. They were to wait for her. She would only be a moment. Needing a little help, she extricated herself from the wooden compartment with its upholstered seat and glass windows. Wherever she turned, huge window displays greeted her. Scenes framed like a stage decorated for a theatrical production. Scrolling script announced the proprietor of the first establishment, Monsieur Vaillant's Exchange, and many more like it. A cornucopia of second-hand treasures, a croquet game, a jack-in-the-box, silver-cast musketeer figurines, dolls with porcelain heads and wooden hands and feet, a sun-faded ball gown, a bearskin, and armoires, bureaus and side tables, their legs preposterously carved, the handles and latches embellished with gold paint and encrusted with jewels. Monsieur had opened one of the cabinets and was adding to the display. A glossy hobby horse complete with hazel switch, silken mane, tasselled bridle and deep brown glass eyes. Meeting her eye, Monsieur's face broke into a salesman's grin. Touching his hands to the horse's rump, he demonstrated its motion when pushed.
Come in, he called, opening the door. "What might I help you with today?"
Inside her cape, she clutched a small bag. She ignored him, lingering at a display case of rare books before making her way to the counter. She could only guess at the value of Nicola's diamond bouquet, and to protect herself from negotiating a poor price, she pretended to be a buyer, taking the seat and cup of tea that was offered, and exclaiming over a host of necklaces, watches, and rings. And then suddenly she had gained her nerve. She would bargain with confidence. "A special price," offered the proprietor, inspecting the facets under magnifying glass and lamp. A book of accounts was open, his quill inked and poised. The offer was impressive, the exchange more than she had expected. Even so, Marie-Catherine haggled. Eventually she nodded, and the dealer poured the coin into a box. She returned outside to the palanquin, the box clutched in her hands. She had a final visit to make before returning to her chambers, to a glass of brandy and her aching feet propped on a chair. Saint-Sulpice was some distance away, and she prized the box open in her lap, the privacy of the hired chair and its drawn curtains allowing her a moment to stir her fingers in the small pile of gold louis d'or and silver écus, counting them once again. She thought of the effort she was expending on behalf of her imprisoned friend, and the bill that was yet to be drawn for the Baron's medical expenses. She had promised Sophie a raise. Angelina's wardrobe was scrimped together from Teresa's hand-me-downs. The shutters in the kitchen were broken. A leak had sprung in the attic. The lining of the case was embroidered with a name in a familiar script. She believed it was the business name of a jeweller who had been famous several decades ago. His ostentatious creations sought out by many fashionable Paris messieurs to secure a fiancé's hand or to maintain the favour of a wife or mistress. However, she had never owned one of those pieces herself. So why was it so familiar? Ah, she remembered. She was barely 15, recently married. After the wedding, Francois had almost immediately returned to his card tables and drinking dens, leaving his young bride to while away the evenings alone. Molière's play, The Learned Women, had opened at the Comédie Française, becoming the talk of Paris, and so her mother had bought them tickets. As a child growing up in Normandy, she had never attended the theatre, and was excited to dress in an expensive gown for the occasion. But she had not been prepared for Molière's ridiculing of the girls of her class, depicting their transformations from mademoiselle into madame as a game of great frivolity and jest. The title of the play referenced Mademoiselle de Scudéry's writings on the value of education for women. In her novels, the writer championed a utopian society of female intellectuals, writers, poets, actors, philosophers, and Molière had taken an immense delight in satirizing her inventions. And this was despite, or perhaps because of, de Scudéry's enormous popularity with her female readers. At 15, Marie-Catherine had read all her serialized Clélier novels and eagerly awaited publication of the next installment. Standing near the Seine, waiting for a carriage, she had been surly when her mother, Judith Angélique, asked for her impressions of the play. Close to angry tears, Marie-Catherine bent down to find a stone to throw into the glittering river. Judith Angélique grasped her by the shoulder, scolding her for behaving like a provincial. She was a madame from Paris now, and had to perform the role appropriately. Marie-Catherine glanced at her mother's gown of deep blue velvet, the silver tulips embroidered on its bodice. Her hair was brushed high off her face, her eyebrows artificially shaped, and there was a large beauty spot on her left cheek. The care and coin Judith Angélique spent on her appearance, while effective where gentlemen were concerned, only created a wall between mother and daughter. She wanted more than anything to squeeze her hands around her mother's waist, to lay her head a moment against the curve of her neck. But Judith Angelique would only stiffen and press her away. She did not wish her gown to be crushed, its expensive fabric marked by her daughter's sweaty fingers. "You are a lady. Behave like one," said Judith Angelique. "But my husband is no gentleman," Marie-Catherine wailed. Gripped by a desperate impulse, why had her mother taken her to this humiliating play? She began to unpin her headdress, casting the veil onto the ground. "He came to you?" asked Judith Angelique, her voice lowered. "I am sorry. I thought he might wait." Marie-Catherine nodded, bending down to retrieve the headdress she remembered. How she had been determined not to grimace nor to show fear. She had bitten down on her lips, making them bleed, her eyes squeezed closed, praying for it to finish, for his heavy weight to be off her, for him to leave her alone in her chamber when it was done. Judith Angelique had been kind then, taking her hand and walking arm in arm with her back to the Baron's apartment. The following day a package was delivered to her room, a small box with the signature of the very same Parisian jeweller sewn on the lining. A stammer of what should have been happiness pulsed inside. But when she opened the box, she found what appeared to be animal droppings. Deflated. Was this a cruel trick or a bizarre mistake? She peered closer at the small round pellets and smelled garlic, parsley, and some other herbs she could not name. With the package, she found a letter from Judith Angelique expressing the concerns she could not voice. She should have spoken to her earlier, she wrote. She hoped Marie-Catherine could forgive her, that it was not too late. There was plenty of time for her to become a mother, but perhaps she was still a little young. When next her husband proposed a visit to her chamber, she must ask that he permit her a moment's privacy to wash. Away from his gaze, she was to place one of the dung-like balls inside her. They would prevent a child coming. Although she had carefully followed Judith Angelique's instructions, the pessaries did not work, and nor did her requests to be left alone. Baron d'Aulnoy had wed her to make himself respectable, and part of their marriage contract, in exchange for the payment given to her family, though her father had passed away, involved her duty to provide him with children. Now, standing outside the pawn-shop, she glanced at the coins in the box. Her mother never stinted in gratifying her own needs. Money was the object that Judith Angelique regarded above all else. And Marie-Catherine was grateful she had not been cast in her mother's image. Judith Angelique's nature had been revealed some 9 months later, in all its cold and stupid glory. When she wore the pendant from the discarded box, Monsieur's craftsmanship was unmistakable, to the christening party held for Marie-Catherine's first child. Oh, the sleep Judith Angelique lost worrying about the Baron's profligate spending of the family's coin, constantly complaining to Marie-Catherine through those early years of marriage. Well, her daughter had deeper sufferings to bear. Marie-Catherine truly detested wealth and its trappings, but she was so very tired of fretting about minor expenses. She lifted several shining écus from the hoard and deposited them into her purse. There, it was done. Nicola would never know the difference if she pocketed something for her troubles. A small payment for services to be rendered. Angelina, the 5th of May. "My favourite," said Alphonse, licking his lips, his wet pink tongue snaking in and out of his mouth. He had convinced Angelina to indulge in a fashionable cordial at a new establishment in town, made of white spirits, steeped in cinnamon and fennel, squeezed lemons and a drop of cochineal, to reflect the grandeur of the Sun King. It was served flamboyantly in a crystal goblet, a taste of the coming summer. "What are your thoughts?" He studied Angelina's face across the table, with its vase of peonies and roses. "Would you believe that stories of women dressing as men are amongst my favourites? Whatever led you to the theme?" Sitting next to Angelina's sparkling drink was the draft of a fairy tale Alphonse had been writing about a young woman who insisted upon joining a campaign to help a king regain his lost fortunes by dressing herself as a boy. She had read it through, delighted and surprised by the references to the Amazonian women of the Fronde, the Princess Conti, who led a revolt in Bordeaux, and the Duchess de Longueville, who gathered a Spanish army to fight the rebels of Paris. "Marie-Catherine's always inserting these powerful women into her works. I thought it sensible to emulate her." "But you must write for yourself, surely?" Angelina leaned forward. "It veers very closely to Belle Belle." As in her mother's story, he had depicted the hero-heroine leaving home, meeting a fairy in a forest who provided armour and weapons. The hero-heroine made his way to a palace where the king's daughter, taken by the intricate designs on his armour, his chivalrous comportment and the dashing figure he cut, decided to make him fall in love with her. What followed was a series of misunderstandings, as the hero-heroine, determined to show himself worthy of the king's trust, offered to fight for him in a great battle. But the princess, not wishing the knight to risk his life, kept him on the palace grounds, carrying out chores designed to prove his devotion, which frustrated him no end. Alphonse slowly shook his head, his eyes raised towards the ceiling. "I'm hopelessly stuck." "You cannot copy her," Angelina whispered. "There are many versions of the tale you might consult to help you write your own. In one of Maman's English novels, she has a scenario where her heroine dresses as a male pilgrim and a lady falls in love with him. He rejects her, but her inclination takes her to the brink of madness, and she won't let go. Also, I used to run a little salon at St. Anne's." "Really?" Alphonse rested his chin in his hands, studying her with great amusement. "We read voraciously. Maman would send us forbidden books, autobiographical novels by the femmes fortes, the strong women of the Fronde, the Duchess de Chevreuse, Marie d'Orléans, and the Duchess de Montpensier. We have them in our library. Let me know if you wish to borrow any. I was raised on them. And do you know that recently Maman's contemporaries have taken up the trope? You have competition. There's Marie-Jeanne L'Héritier." "It appears I've taken a diversion down the wrong path. This seems your domain, not mine." Angelina was excited. "You must read L'Héritier's fairy tale, Marmoisin. I think it inspired Belle Belle, though Maman would never admit as much. The plots are quite different. Marmoisin's a knight, formerly known as Lenore, who joins the king's army, and rather than encountering trouble with a woman, L'Héritier has a fellow knight, Prince Cloderic, harbour an attraction toward him. The problem for Marmoisin is the opposite of Belle Belle's. The prince suspects he's a woman dressed as a man and subjects him to tests to prove his manhood, even inviting Marmoisin to bathe naked with him. Marmoisin has to wriggle out of all the traps, which he succeeds in doing, of course, and lives on his own terms." Alphonse regarded her with a peculiar expression. "What is it?" "Nothing," he replied, shaking his head. "Nothing at all. Oh, and one of my most treasured, Angelina thumped the table, by Madame Henriette Julie de Murat, is The Savage. She felt a ripple of excitement along her arms, just speaking the writer's name out loud. Madame de Murat's reputation had almost been destroyed by a recent court scandal, the Comtesse offending the king's morganatic wife, Madame de Maintenon, by appearing at the court of Versailles dressed in native Breton costume. The incident amused many in Paris's intellectual circles. The king's commoner wife had been in full hypocritical display, but the damage it wrought upon Madame de Murat's standing was troubling. Just like Angelina's mother, Madame de Murat had separated from her husband. She had gone so far as to write a memoir about the affair, branding him an abusive and controlling fiend who on more than one occasion put her life in danger with his beatings. The marriage was arranged, forced, as was the path for a noblewoman like Madame de Murat, born to a father who was a colonel in the infantry regiment. Angelina was reading her memoir, which detailed the story of her curbed domestic arrangements, although its publication had led to her being cast out of the noble society to which she had been born. Madame de Murat had even spent a period in hiding outside the city, shunned and criticized for choosing to live a free woman. Madame de Murat was also notorious for her preference for female lovers. Her daring fascinated Angelina, and was probably the real reason she preferred her cross-dressing story above all others. The heroine of The Savage had adopted the ways of a man to flee her arranged marriage. The same had been true of her mother's heroine, Julie, in The History of Hippolyte, although that was a side story in a book packed with adventures and intrigue. In The Savage, the heroine's passing as a man was the main plot. "It pleases me to see you happy," said Alphonse. "I'm not accustomed to it." Angelina picked up a pastry from a plate in the centre of the table and took a bite. The waiter, dressed in the Armenian style, in a bejewelled turban and orange robe, refilled their glasses from a crystal jug. She had not realised how much she missed talking about stories. Did it matter if she could not puzzle Alphonse out? She must not compare him to Henrietta. Perhaps, like in the tales she had recalled, a person's sex did not matter. The feeling that prickled and stirred when she was near Alphonse, when she received a correspondence from him, when he fluttered into her mind at the end of each day, the moment she opened her eyes of a morning, she would stay in bed a little longer just to think of his face, should simply be accepted. She should not concern herself with putting a leash around what it might mean. Like the Sleeping Beauty, she had been stirred back to life following a long sleep, and that was what really mattered. "Maman has been in a state," she said after Alphonse had paid the bill. "Father's ill. Along with Nicola's miseries, she's taken it into her head to look after him." Angelina had to visit the apothecary, which she rather enjoyed. Still, she would like to have lingered. Alphonse regarded her. "If I really had courage, I'd write about your father and mother, though perhaps I shouldn't look a gift horse in the mouth." "What, and send your audience to sleep? I shan't think they're an interesting topic."
"Baron d'Aulnoy is rather infamous, though."
Angelina glanced up the street, hoping to find a carriage. "Mind you watch yourself. He was imprisoned in the Bastille. We never talk of it."
"It's only a thought, given that the piece I'm working on has fallen dead under my fingers," said Alphonse.
"I shall help you to revive it," said Angelina. "Leave it with me. Perhaps I can make a note or two." Alphonse offered to ride with her to the apothecary, joking that in exchange she might recommend him something to help his sleep. He found it hard to rest after an evening's writing. His mind jumped and bounced about. "It depends if you are serious or just mocking me. A glass of wine or two should do the trick." She was glad Alphonse volunteered to be her chaperone. The apothecary was in a poor part of Paris, and she hadn't been looking forward to going alone. They travelled for a mile alongside the Seine, the cordial wearing off, her cares beginning to return. She worried she was taking up Alphonse's precious writing time. For several minutes they were stopped at a crossroads, just a little way from the apothecary. A wheel had come off a cart and was being rescued from the middle of the road. She peered into the busy street. Her attention fell on a narrow alleyway, the half-timbered buildings bending over slightly at the 5th level, as if they might slip together. Washing hung out of the windows to dry. A row of geraniums, red and pink, bloomed from a bright blue ceramic pot. A high-pitched noise made her start, and she put her hand to her chest. Against the walls of the first apartment, she noticed a flare of blue silk. Violent in its dye, the most expensive pigments used to achieve its eye-catching hue. A Chinese-inspired mantua, rucked up, stockinged legs above pretty street shoes. A woman was pressed against the side of the building, her legs parted. Into the space was fitted, like a puzzle piece, a large man, taller than the woman by a full head, wavy brown hair fallen below his shoulders, dressed in the uniform of the city police. The envy of his comrades, she imagined. The woman's hair spilled down the front of her dress. As the pair moved together, the woman's mantua became further dislodged, and Angelina saw her bodice, its buttons opened, the flowers painted on the silk, lace in her hair, rouge on her cheeks, too many face patches. The woman's head was tipped back, the man's face buried in her cleavage. He pressed into the woman, and she submitted, the couple performing a writhing ballet against the walls. Aware that she might be caught looking but unable to take her eyes from the pair, rutting like dogs in the street, Angelina felt her cheeks turn pink. The trinket sellers and orange hawkers, the quacks and working women were all going about their business. Angelina patted her forehead. She needed to open the window. It was stuffy inside the carriage. "Hurry up with the wheel," she thought, forcing her fingers not to reach out and knock on the driver's window. No, she should be patient. She turned her head towards Alphonse and saw that he was staring at her, his lips wet and full. She wanted to trace the tip of her finger along his nose, his jaw. She wanted to take his head and pull it down, so that he was lost in the folds of her own bodice. Alphonse looked at her, his expression open, his eyes searching hers. What did he want her to do? How should she respond? She closed her eyes and let out her breath. She felt her heart hammering, the little vein in her temple pulsing. She took the base of the curtain in her fingers and pulled it shut. There. She, need not be bothered by such vulgarity. "I wish this carriage would hurry up." She hoped her voice did not sound husky. She was filled head to toe with shame, with desire. She wished she were alone. She wished the carriage would not move. She wished she could watch the couple, take in their every frenzied move, stare nakedly at them. But Alphonse was with her. Alphonse was watching her, and she could not respond. She had lost her voice, like the policeman nearing the end of his busy thrusting. In Angelina's mind, the scene continued. The woman grasped her hat and looked around, seemingly growing impatient. Angelina embellished the scene in her imagination, recalling the horses she had seen mating, the rooster chasing the chickens in the garden at St. Anne's. The carriage began to move, and she turned her thoughts to the items she would purchase at the apothecary's, the quantities of each, and whether she had enough coin in her purse. Alphonse did not feel like waiting in the carriage, and instead accompanied Angelina into the apothecary. He was soon chatting to the perfumer, watching his pretty young assistant as she dabbed the stopper from a small glass bottle onto the palms of his gloves. Angelina turned towards the front of the busy shop. She waited in line for 10 minutes before finally handing her order to the apothecary. As he worked, she tried to forget the scene she had witnessed. Just when she was beginning to imagine Paris as her home, starting to enjoy its frenetic bustle, she had been confronted by the sight of the alley coupling. All the work she had done to put the convent behind her threatened to unravel. Since leaving St. Anne's, she had witnessed a fight, a stabbing, a theft. She had viewed women with babies at their breast, children at their hips, putting their hands out to ask for money. She had seen unkempt youths covered in sickness. She had peered into the soulless eyes of drinkers and gamblers and almost choked on the filthy stench of night soil. How on earth was she supposed to feel safe? All she wished for was calm, solace, comfort. To have her heart sit on its perch in her chest, a finch in its cage, any singing that it carried out under her strict control. Not to have it flustered and smashing against the sides of its prison, frightened within breaths of its life. It was too much for her. She was used to denial, contemplation.
"Will that be all?"
asked the apothecary. His lips curled into a friendly smile beneath his florid nostrils. He had a striped kerchief at his neck, and his belly strained against a leather apron, like a butcher's, to protect his skin from the herbs and medicines he dealt in. Before Angelina stood a glass bottle, filled with a glaucous green liquid, a package of herbs to be steeped in hot water and mixed with ginger and honey and lemon, a tin of lozenges to ease her father's hacking cough, and 2 plants, a fresh comfrey and a lavender, that she had decided would cost less to tend herself rather than continuing to draw her supply from the apothecary. She bought packets of medicinal herb seeds imported from Amsterdam to plant in the courtyard at the back of Marie-Catherine's apartment. While she showed no interest in gardening herself, her mother delighted in fragrant teas and sweet-smelling pomades and encouraged the idea. Angelina was counting out coins when she caught a sharp whiff of perfume. A voice behind her protested. She glanced to her left, shocked to discover that the woman in the blue mantua was standing next to her, having pushed her way to the front of the line. She rested her elbows on the counter. "I shall only be a moment," she said to the man who had protested, flashing him a look one might give an irritating lapdog. "My dear madame," exclaimed the apothecary, looking fondly at the woman. The woman cast her eyes over the bottles and packages Angelina had amassed before her. "Someone's faring poorly." She picked up the pain-relieving draught, the strongest Angelina knew about, and turned it in her hands. She put it down again, pinning Angelina with her eyes. "This is meant for real pain, but it doesn't work." "For my father," said Angelina. The words came rushing out. She didn't know why she was speaking to the woman, but her rouged cheeks and kohl-lined eyes, her creased brow and stunning though faded beauty commanded Angelina's attention. "He's extremely unwell. To make him comfortable." The woman looked at the apothecary. She leaned forward on the counter. "Why don't you give her some proper medicine?" she said, her voice a low whisper. "You never spare me." She winked at Angelina. "May I suggest preparation le Chinese?" she ventured. "I nursed my tumour-ridden husband with it until his last days." "It's expensive," said the apothecary, "but effective. One only need ask. It's not in my catalogue." "Money is never better spent when it comes to crippling pain," said the woman. Arrested by the woman's glamour and attention, by what she had seen her do not half an hour earlier in the street, Angelina nodded at the apothecary. "Just a small bottle," she said. "Thank you," she said to the woman. Angelina did not mention that she knew all about Preparation Le Chinese. Indeed, she had not considered it for her father, despite the multitude of his illnesses, but she knew from what she had seen in the convent that it was a powerful drug. The third sister in charge had been addicted to the solution, and it had fallen to Sister Agatha to take care of her. But Sister Agatha had been ill one weekend and forgotten to include the order for the drug on the list she sent out to the apothecary. The nun had run out of the supply she administered herself. Angelina had been called into the infirmary to look after her, for she was fitting and thrashing and turning about in her cot, as if the devil were trying to choke her. She writhed and foamed at the mouth, attacking another nursing sister. Prayer, brandy, tying her to the bed had not worked. The woman would not stop begging for the physician, insisting he oblige her with another dose of the drug. Against conventual practice, Angelina had called the physician out. She watched him administer a dose to the nun, and then marvelled as she quickly calmed herself down. The following day, Sister Agatha had taken her aside, had her give over the nun's medicine, and told her she would take care of the case from then on. She refused to speak with Angelina about what had happened. The impression it had left on Angelina, aside from one of shock, was that it must have been an effective drug indeed. She studied the nun for the next few weeks, and her behaviour was normal. From then on, whenever she caught sight of the high-ranking sister, she was reminded of the incident in the infirmary. But the nun seemed in good health, and Sister Agnes never spoke of the matter or the drug again. Perhaps her father had a tumour, like the woman's husband. Surely it wouldn't hurt to keep the medicine on hand, should his suffering become unbearable. Alphonse helped her to sidestep the garbage in the street. Sitting in the carriage, her purchases at her feet, he placed a small, plain-wrapped package in her lap. "For you." "Thank you, Monsieur Apparide." She touched his arm, and he did not shrink back. She moved, opening the package tied with ribbon, her elbow brushing his, deliberate. Again, he did not pull away. She looked at him, and he met her eyes, a wordless intimacy passing between them. Inside the package was a handkerchief, red silk, a posy of lavender and thyme carefully wrapped in its folds. "Here, let me pin it to your wrist." "Oh, it's lovely." She brought her wrist to her nose. "And so considerate. There's no getting used to the stink of this part of town. Here, breathe it in." Folding the handkerchief, she glanced through the carriage's window, savouring the scented air, a feeling of pleasure opening inside her body. When the carriage arrived at Marie-Catherine's apartment, Alphonse had his footman help her with her packages. He kissed her hand, tipping his hat, before climbing back up the small set of stairs. Watching as the carriage disappeared around the corner of her street, making its way alongside the Seine to Alphonse's home, Angelina felt a vein in her neck begin to throb. Opening the door to her mother's apartment, she slipped inside, closing it quickly behind her. The maids had not heard her come in. Her packages dropped to the floor, and she closed her eyes, let her weight slump against the heavy oak, put her hands to her hot cheeks. Marie-Catherine, the 18th of May. Angelina crouched in the strip of dirt in the tiny courtyard behind the kitchen, inspecting the leaves of a comfrey plant. Earlier in the week she had borrowed a maid's apron and set to work, digging out the weeds and turning over the soil, making holes with a spoon and pouring dried seeds from a multitude of paper packages into the depressions. Marie-Catherine sipped her tea, marvelling at this creature who was her daughter. She hadn't realised how willingly Angelina had been trained in herbs at St. Anne's. How was it that instead of helping her along with her struggling manuscript, she had been spending her days preparing medicines for the Baron, and her evenings reading the drafts of Marie-Catherine's protégé? Angelina did not seem to comprehend, or if she did, found ways not to dwell upon the fact, their pressing financial circumstances. Indeed, if Marie-Catherine was not mistaken, her daughter appeared to be in her element. Whatever was her secret, she wondered. Standing at the back door, she called out to Angelina, wishing her a good morning. "When you're finished, clean up, please, and find a smart dress to wear." "Where are we going?" asked Angelina, a smudge of dirt on her nose. "I'm busy." "I promise we won't be long," said Marie-Catherine. "I don't feel like travelling alone today. I'm too upset." She took the letter that had arrived that morning from her pocket and unfolded it. "Who's been writing to you?" asked Angelina, frowning. "Your father," said Marie-Catherine. "He's looking into the background of Nicola's associates." Angelina threw her trowel into the dirt. She stomped through the back door, pushing past Marie-Catherine. Standing at the ewer, she washed the dirt from her fingers. "Is anything wrong?" asked Marie-Catherine. But Angelina did not answer. Wiping off her hands on a cloth, she marched out of the kitchen. Marie-Catherine stood listening to her daughter's footsteps, which echoed up the stairwell, all the way to the top floor of the apartment. She heard her chamber door open and close. Shaking her head, what mercurial moods her daughter was having, Marie-Catherine turned her attention back to the letter. Her estranged husband had mustered his last reserves after the messenger sent over Angelina's medicines and put the word out about Nicola's case. "I cannot say what it is worth, but I discovered several gleaming little nuggets of intelligence for you. In the tavern that one of my sources frequents, the fellow came across news that a certain Catelin, an all-purpose chap who hangs around the docks, cutting deals and running errands for galley criminals, has been peddling stories about his involvement in a conspiracy organised by Madame Tiquet. The man is a thorough degenerate, so you should consider yourself warned as to the veracity of his claims. Apparently he is prone to bouts of regret for his criminal activities, and goes on searches for redemption, during which time he confesses to myriad crimes. He has sought nuns, priests, prostitutes, and fellow ruffians to listen to and absolve him of his sins. But it seems he cannot learn a thorough lesson, or earn a steady income, because, come the next season of hardship, he returns to his unrewarding life of crime. Catelin has been bragging in a tavern at the docks that Madame Tiquet's valet came to him several years ago with a handsome proposition. He was asked to gather together a band of ruffians and carry out a favour, for which he would be handsomely rewarded. The valet from the Tiquet household showed him a purse full of coin, promising that it was but an instalment, the remainder of the sum of which was to be tallied and paid once the deed had been carried out. No matter how my informant tried to cajole the fellow, he failed to reveal the nature of the favour, except to say it was a capital crime. He grinned at my man, showing his several remaining teeth, and drowned out the evening in a pot of brandy. The fellow was both an idiot and a fool, but I have an ear on the scoundrel. It is all very well and good, but the business the chap has been ranting about occurred more than 3 years ago, and hardly applies to the charges Nicolas Tiquet currently faces. "Do as you like with these words," advised Francois. He went on to write that he had another piece of information come to him by his own manservant. This rumour was doing the rounds, not of the taverns, but of the back rooms and corridors of Paris's palace and manor houses, on the tongues and in the ears of the housekeepers and servants, who were connected to one another in a warren of generations-long relationships. They kept their own counsel and gossiped behind tight lips, avoiding the law. Nobody wanted to lose their job. Francois offered his dunce of a footman money for information, and this was the story the fellow delivered. Quite curious indeed. The events took place at an earlier time than the affair with Catalin, some 5 years hence. An uncle's cousin's sister recalled the incident and relayed it on the great serpent of Chinese backroom whispers to my footman. A young fellow employed in the role of valet de chambre to Monsieur Claude Tiquet had developed a fear of his master's wife. When pressed, he could not explain how or why, just that it was a feeling, the flesh creeping beneath his skin. The woman was very beautiful, but calculating and cold, whenever he was in her presence. You may interpret the material as meaningful or irrelevant, whatever you like. Perhaps don't pay it too much heed in matters to do with the justice system. Regardless, relations between Madame and Monsieur Tiquet were frosty indeed, according to the fellow, who suffered trembling fits serving at dinner. There was a great fight one evening that led to the severing of cordialities at supper time. Instead, Monsieur Tiquet requested that his meals be brought to him in his room. Not long afterwards, the youth was given instructions from Madame to bring his master a porringer of broth. It was his favourite. He had not spoken directly to his mistress, rather the message had come down through the foul-mouthed old cook, and there was a gleam in his eye when he gave the boy the bowl. This aroused the suspicions of the fanciful young man. As he climbed the stairs to his master's apartments, he passed Madame, red-faced and distracted, as if she had been crying. She asked what he was doing with the bowl of broth. The fellow relayed the cook's message, and a knowing look passed across the woman's face. The boy got into a fluster, apparently, as he crossed the threshold into his master's chambers, affecting at tripping over the rug. The bowl and its contents were tossed onto the floor. His master shouted at him, and he was too overcome to respond. Instead, he fled that very night, for he was convinced that the strange-smelling broth was laced with poison. And that was the last the Tiquet family heard of the lad or his relatives, for he disappeared. It is said he left Paris for Amsterdam. Apparently the tale was well known, but there was no proof it was anything more than legend. Women were usually the ones accused of being poisoners. Not strong enough to carry out violent acts, Francois wrote, the weaker sex employed powders, unguents and broths to bring their enemies down. Regard the king's former mistress, Madame de Montespan, who was rumoured to have resorted to such arts. Marie-Catherine folded the letter and returned it to her pocket. She would ignore his pettiness. Oh, but she was unsatisfied. Francois had provided no word on Jacques Mouet's whereabouts or involvement. He must be the conspiring valet. Just paragraphs of drivel about an imaginative kitchen boy and a desperate reprobate, and a request for more herbs. Although she felt vindicated at manipulating the Baron's attentions, at least she had him on her side. Her inspiration that Angelina act as his nurse, a success. She could not rest. There was much to do. "Might you join me?" asked Marie-Catherine. "No, thank you," replied Angelina, barely concealing a grimace. Marie-Catherine stepped into the small chapel of the Virgin, making a sign of the cross before a marble statue of Our Lady. She closed her eyes to pray, but could not concentrate. She kept looking at a painting of Saint Dymphna, mounted on the wall to the left of the statue. At 19, she had come to Saint-Sulpice seeking Father Etienne's protection. He had been in the baptistry conducting a ceremony. An enormous red velvet curtain was draped over the painting, and the young Marie-Catherine, fearing she would be discovered, had searched behind it. The curtain was only partially drawn, and thinking quickly, she stepped between the oil painting and the fabric, drawing the heavy folds across her trembling body. She waited until the sounds of Father Etienne's voice quietened, and the family attending the baptism had left the cathedral. Breathing in the smoky incense, she stilled her fears, her heart slowing its urgent pace. When the building had at last fallen silent, she crept out of her hiding place and wandered in and out of the aisles, searching for the priest's private office. Her prayers concluded, Marie-Catherine motioned for Angelina to follow her towards the centre of the church. She had spied a deacon, cleaning items at the altar. Angelina walked at a slow pace, a pointed rebuke, it seemed. She carried a basket at her side and a sulky pout on her lips. When asked to accompany Marie-Catherine on her errand, Angelina had protested that she had better things to do with her afternoon than pass it in the presence of a man of the cloth. On the carriage ride to the church, Marie-Catherine discovered the reason for her daughter's insolence. She was annoyed with her for resuming correspondence with the Baron. Why did she always seek an excuse to have contact with him? Was she oblivious to his detrimental influence on her state of mind? While she did not mind fixing him medicine, she could not say she was impressed with Marie-Catherine's habit of falling back on his advice. Why was she unable to change? Incapable of learning to put her own interests ahead of his? It must be that she secretly relished the foul tempers he left her stewing in. The golden vessel of the monstrance had been removed from the tabernacle, and was sitting on the altar, the door of the lunette opened for polishing. Father Etienne was writing a sermon, said the deacon, putting down his cloth, but he should be finished. One could set a clock to his habits, and he had spent his customary hour and a half at the task. Marie-Catherine apologized for the interruption, but the friendly deacon told her not to be concerned. The priest would welcome their company. "Best get this over with," muttered Angelina. She strode towards the priest's chambers, knocking several times on the door. Marie-Catherine shuffled down the aisle to catch up.
This ends CD 6.